Okay, great. So please join me in a salute to our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. May I have a motion to approve the minutes from the last meeting?
I've already reviewed them and moved to do so.
I'll second.
Great. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, the minutes are approved. Now we'll move on to special agenda items, announcements. We are so lucky. Tracy, did you want to say anything first? Great. So we have our building and safety manager, Ariel Socaras, who's going to provide us an update on the city's seismic retrofit program. Thank you.
Hi, Jay. Good evening. Good evening. Wonderful. Now it's fine. Thank you. Well, good evening, Chair and board members and members of the public. Again, my name is Ariel Socaras, and I'm the Building and Safety Division Manager. And I've seen your agenda, so I'll be mindful of that, while still hopefully giving you a good sense of where the seismic retrofit program stands. But of course, if I've failed to cover anything, feel free to ask me any questions afterwards. Real quickly, the ordinance was adopted by council in March of 2017. It covers 5 different building types, and through windshield surveys and working with an outside nonprofit engineering agency, we identified just over 2,000 buildings as being potentially seismically vulnerable and subject to the requirements of the seismic ordinance. More than 80% of these buildings are soft stories. While the ordinance was adopted in March of 2017, the city began noticing property owners in August of 2017. And given the volume of properties, what we did was we batched the notifications based on building types. Each mailing was roughly 200 to 400 notices each. And again, we categorize those notices by building types, and the final batch of notice, the first batch was sent out on August 14th of 2017, and the final batch was mailed out on July 30th of 2018. So that July 30th notice officially ended the noticing of properties, or that phase of the program. So referencing the table up on the screen, you can see that there are various dates and numbers reflected for the 5 different building types. There's concrete tilt-ups, there's unreinforced masonry buildings, soft story buildings, non-ductile, as well as steel moment frames. And from the table, you'll notice that there have only been 2 deadlines that have passed to date, and those are for the structural evaluation reports that are for unreinforced masonry buildings and concrete tilt-up buildings. Those deadlines were December of 2017 and November of 2017. There are 2 other deadlines that are soon approaching, and those are the unreinforced masonry retrofits, which are required to be completed by August of 2019, and evaluation reports for a subset of the soft story buildings is required by September of this year. As we did with the first round of deadlines that passed, we will be notifying property owners that are out of compliance with a courtesy reminder notice, providing 30 days to respond prior to forwarding a list over to code enforcement for enforcement action. The table also details the number of cases closed, as well as the number of plan check submittals received, the number of permits issued, and the number of retrofits completed for each building type. So you're able to see the program's progress to date. It should be clarified for the cases closed column. This is a total number of cases closed by either a completion of retrofit or the provision of information to the city that prior retrofit work had been done, or maybe a building was identified inappropriately. So just some general additional information about public outreach and comments that has happened. The city hosted 3 community meetings within that noticing phase, and we targeted, the first meeting was focused around just general retrofit information. And then the latter two were more focused towards soft story. And they were scheduled and targeted in line with the way that the noticing occurred. The 3 community meetings were held between November of 2017 and August of 2018. And just to highlight some of the main issues that were raised by the public, they were primarily how should someone go about finding an engineer, concerns about the ability to even be able to find an engineer or contractor due to the demand that's being generated in the city and in the region with these other retrofit ordinances that are occurring, as well as any potential assistance with the funding of the retrofit work. So the meetings, in addition to just giving them general background information about retrofits, why they're important, and a description of the process of the program, the city has been working closely with CIOSC, the Structural Engineering Association of Southern California. They're nonprofits. This is the mission of their agency. They have a lot of information on their website, so we've been directing the public to their information about how to get 3 bids and make sure they're licensed, things like that. On all that information is on CIOSC's website. About the concern with the ability to find an engineer given all the retrofits occurring in the region, it was a concern, and it does seem logical. We as staff have not gotten that sense or even heard that type of feedback from anybody. So not to say that it doesn't exist, but staff isn't aware of anyone running into this difficulty. And lastly, with the issue of potential assistance with funding, up to now, the only thing that's really been offered and even publicized on our website is the PACE program, which allows you to get loans and pay the loans back through property assessment. However, one additional thing that may happen, hopefully by the end of this year or early 2020, just a couple weeks ago, the city submitted a grant application to FEMA to potentially assist with the retrofit of soft story buildings. So that application was just submitted to the California Office of Emergency Services last week. They will have it until November, potentially requesting more information from us and going back and forth. And then in November, it goes to FEMA for their formal review, and hopefully we will hear or get a decision from FEMA by early 2020. The specifics and the details of the program have yet to really be ironed out specifically, but we do have a general idea of there being an application process or an open application process for the buildings that have been determined to be eligible. As I mentioned, they're the soft stories, the priority 2s and the priority 3s in the retrofit program. And then depending on the number of interested applications that we get, that will then lead to how much money we'll allot to the various property owners and how that will be distributed. So with that, that concludes my presentation. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, and thank you for that quick and concise presentation. I'm glad to see progress is being made, but we all have a long way to go. The FEMA program you mentioned, I'm just curious, we've had some landlords really step up, and I mean, as I walk the neighborhood, I see signs and construction going on. If they've already completed it and paid for it, how would they be treated with regards to this FEMA program that we're just now applying for?
Yeah, I looked into that as part of the initial research, and FEMA, as some of you may be aware, is very strict on their requirements. Auditing of how money spent to be eligible for reimbursement and things of that nature. But to address your question is if any actual work has begun, a project is ineligible in FEMA's guidelines. So they would not be eligible for any reimbursement if work has started.
Interesting.
Okay.
Thank you. I mean, it's not your fault. It's
It's
just, it's a problem. I mean,
yeah.
it's a
it's an
conundrum.
unfortunate timing issue.
Okay, so I think it's no secret that I feel very strongly about this issue. I'm quite concerned, and I think that we need to be able to provide safe and affordable financial products. We need to incentivize our landlords to be able to do this quickly. We just had 2 earthquakes last week. I think we're all very concerned about this. And I know that Mr. Johnson has brought to our attention multiple times his suggestions for how to do this, so we appreciate that. Similar to potentially what other jurisdictions have looked at, have we thought about doing a pre-qualified list of contractors who the city deems to be pre-qualified? Again, not making any specific endorsements, but just knowing that there is some level of vetting process such that our landlords can go to these pre-qualified contractors.
It's been discussed preliminarily, but it's been long-standing city policy not to endorse or give the sense of endorsement to private companies. We could discuss it further if we see some valid. I haven't seen any examples out there to how you're referring to being.
Yeah, so I
qualified.
think like in other jurisdictions, it's pretty common actually to do like an RFSQ process where you would have a master agreement of pre-qualified vendors. You're not promising any of them any business, but and I don't necessarily know that that's an endorsement. Again, you would still have to compete to be the person most qualified, but I just a suggestion. I know that there are other contracts that, for example, Metro has where they have jobs developers and they have a pre-qualified list of jobs developers. You just might want to look at other jurisdictions about that. So I would strongly encourage that so our landlords know that someone's not going to be taking advantage of them, especially in a situation where you might have price gouging. And then secondarily, I think, again, it's no secret that I'm not a fan of PACE. It puts something on your property taxes without, well, I think there might have been changes to the law to do a means test to see if you can actually pay for what's against your property taxes. But again, I think, there have been a lot of issues from a consumer protection standpoint. Have you guys thought about putting together any sort of like low interest, safe and affordable financial products for our smaller landlords to avail themselves of?
Building and safety specifically hasn't. No, it would need to be a larger policy issue from the city to implement something like that.
Okay, and I think we've written a letter to that effect. Yep, we have opined on that issue. And then finally, well, actually, not finally. What's our chances of getting this FEMA grant? Do we know?
No, but I think we've put together a good, strong packet, and in the workshops that, excuse me, the workshops that I attended, I got the sense that both the state agency and FEMA are more than willing to distribute this money to agencies that need it. So as long as everything is in there, I really do think that we have a good shot of getting it.
Great. And then finally, how are we incentivizing our landlords to complete these in a timely manner, given that, look, we're seeing not very many retrofits being completed. We have a long period of time under which to do them. And again, like I just mentioned, we just had 2 earthquakes last week.
Yeah, it's been difficult for our division. I mean, to be entirely frank, this new program has been implemented and placed in our administration without any additional resources to help move it along.
So we might want to lobby council for additional resources to expedite some of this, is what you're saying?
That would be fantastic.
Okay,
sure, yeah.
all right,
But
noted.
we're trying to send out reminders as best we can. We have a couple deadlines, as I mentioned, coming up, so we will be sending out reminders there as well. We did implement a potentially simplified plan review process for soft stories, where there was like a pre-screen checklist. If you checked all the right boxes, you wouldn't need to be routed to planning or mobility. So that sort of helped move things along for some eligible projects. But
Have we thought about financial incentives to completing more timely? Could we think about that?
we could, in terms of like maybe reduce plan review fees again.
Just suggesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we should help our predominantly small mom and pop landlords here. And I think that we all want to keep everyone safe. So I know that this isn't directly within our purview, but we all hear a lot about retrofitting, and we just want to do whatever we can to help. So if there's anything that we can do, happy to do it.
Sure. Well,
Yeah.
we'll continue to look into that. Fees are a bit of a touchy subject.
I know.
But yes.
Yeah. Okay. Did anyone else want to ask anything, comment anything? I feel strongly about this. Okay. Thank you so much for coming here and providing
Sure.
an update. We really appreciate it.
Anytime. Thank you.
And I just want to make a comment. Someone did request to speak on this. We don't have public comments on informational items, but you will be able to speak during the public comment period, which is now. Yep, sure. Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay, I just wanted to make a couple of announcements. By now, all tenants and property owners should have received the summer mailing that we send out regarding the general adjustment. Property owners also should have received the registration fee bill. If anybody hasn't received the bill, please contact our office. We will provide a duplicate for you. The fees need to be paid by August 1st in order for owners to be able to pass through half of the fee to tenants and to increase the rents. We encourage you to use the online bill payment option this year. It's less than the cost of a stamp, just 35 cents, and will ensure that your payment is received on time. The other thing I wanted to mention is that we do a workshop every year about calculating the rent increase. That's this coming Tuesday evening at 6:30 with a 6:15 check-in. Any property owners or property managers who have questions about filling out the notice of rent increase or calculating the increase or the surcharges can sign up for that. Please contact our office to do so. We're at 310-458-8751. I'm sorry I misspoke. It's Monday night. Yeah, I have Tuesday, July 15th. They don't go together. Sorry, it's Monday, July 15th. So, all right, those were my announcements.
Thank you, Tracy. And I would assume that we're doing heavy outreach to get people to go to that. I know I got an email, so thank you. Appreciate it. All right, moving on to public comment. This is requests from members of the public to speak to the board on an issue of general interest to the community and not within our subject, that is within our subject matter jurisdiction and not on the agenda tonight. So we have Josh Kammerer, sorry if I pronounced that wrong, Bill Davids, Jay Johnson. Yeah, come on up to the podium.
And while the first speaker's coming up, I'm going to pass out to you something that Mr. Davids would like you to have when he speaks, so I'll pass that out.
And you have 3 minutes.
Hi, board. Thanks for having me. All right. My name is Josh Kammerer, and I live at 1111 17th Street, Unit F. And I have occupied this unit since February of 2005. My unit is directly above the garages, which means that it is above and physically connected to the construction site of the soft-story seismic retrofit scheduled to begin on July 29th. I support the retrofit and understand that it's required to protect the health and safety of residents. I'm here to advocate, though, that I temporarily be relocated during the retrofit because failing to do so could adversely affect my health, which is contrary to the very reason why the retrofit is being mandated. The speaker earlier actually did not comment on any effect to tenants at all, which I found interesting. The garage ceiling, that's the subfloor of my entire unit, is made of permeable wood, which allows high decibel noise, vibrations, hazardous dust, toxic fumes, carcinogenic odors, welding gas, and smoke that will be generated during the retrofit to enter my unit and are serious health hazards. The retrofit under my unit is estimated for 40 days, 6 days a week for 7 weeks. The work is Monday to Friday, 8 to 6, and Saturday, 9 to 5 during the daytime usability of the unit, and anything that permeates the unit will remain for at least another day. During this timeline, my entire livable space will be compromised. Additionally, being that the unit has to be sealed to reduce dust and noise during the summer months, the unit will also become excessively hot and uninhabitable without air conditioning. Excessive heat, high decibel noise, hazardous dust, and smoke cause serious impacts on health, and living in my unit during the retrofit would be a breach of the implied warranty of habitability. I have requested to the owner, management, and construction company to temporarily relocate me, and so far they have not agreed. I have done extensive research on this topic, which led me to contacting the Rent Control Board and the City Building and Safety Office, and I've documented the back and forth between many different people. I learned that to ensure tenant safety, a means and methods plan is typically conducted, but was not required by Peter Tung, the city's senior plan check engineer, despite not ever visiting the retrofit site, which I personally confirmed. I got it. If he had visited, then he would have seen the permeable wood subfloor beneath my unit and the retrofit area. In summary, I appeal to this board because two of the goals renters across the city elected you to achieve is to ensure that renters get a fair return and have a maintained property to reside in. My situation, which is not unique to other renters, requires you to step in and ensure that the means and methods of the retrofit directly beneath my apartment is not going to damage my health. I am not asking for the retrofit work to stop. I am asking that you help me advocate for a temporary relocation for the duration of the project based on the circumstances that I've articulated. Thanks.
Thank you. Commissioner Phyllis?
So I have a direction for staff on this. I'm not going to ask anything. Typically, we don't. I want to request that at our next meeting, we put on an item to communicate with City Council about potential subsidies for property owners to assist with relocation. I'm concerned about what our speaker, Mr. Kameyer, has discussed. And in particular, I'm concerned about the impacts of hazardous materials. I know many of these buildings were constructed with asbestos in them. I think, Mr. Kameyer brings a really important issue to our attention. I thank him, and I think we need to address this because I also know that property owners are feeling the pinch of already taking on the pricing for relocation or for taking on the increases for retrofitting, and I think we need to find a way to cut them some slack. So please agendize that at the next meeting. Thanks.
Thanks. Appreciate that. I would also request that Mr. Costello, have you spoken with Mr. Kameyer? He is our resident expert and can give you some personalized advice. We're not giving you any sort of legal advice, just information, because there are some things that we potentially could do to help you here. And I think, thank you for bringing this to our attention. We absolutely try to put policies in place to prevent this type of thing from happening. So thank you. Ms. Condon would like to make a comment. Go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to mention that it is the building department who would make a determination if a unit was made uninhabitable by the work that's being conducted. So if you feel, or if anybody feels that work going on a property is making a unit unsafe, the proper people to call are the Code Enforcement Division. They will send an officer out to take a look and make that evaluation and then communicate with the building officials. So there are processes in place to look into that once the work has started.
Once the work is started.
Correct.
Right. So I think
They
he's,
can't, at this point, they can't determine that it's unsafe. They need to see what's going on. So,
right. I think, well, anyways, we're not going to debate this because it's not, this is, yeah, go ahead.
For the public's, because, we don't typically address during public comment, but for the public's edification, Tracy's correct. The building and safety and code enforcement would be after the work has started. The purpose of a means and methods plan is to anticipate impacts. So the neighborhood preservation coordinator and people that we do work with, we could advise them to update us as to what, if anything, they do currently with expectations and as far as the means and methods plans are concerned. That is something that can be looked at before, but not the others, not until during. It's just not possible in the law. So that's the only thing I wanted to say for the public's clarification. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Costello's right. Mr. Costello is going to talk with you. Yeah. All right. So, sorry. No. Yeah. Thank you for coming. Bill Davids.
Good evening. Back when we were talking about the bond surcharges, the issue that happily got resolved, Commissioner Phyllis brought up the fact that we were entering into a period of much higher inflation, which would be reflected in our general adjustments. Now, this isn't scientific, it's anecdotal. I do a lot of walking around my neighborhood. I walk around an adjacent neighborhood. I know a lot of seniors, and while we have a noble objective in the city of Santa Monica to have seniors age in place, unfortunately, that's not really happening right now with our general adjustments due to the higher rate of inflation in the LA Riverside area. The Federal Reserve is telling us inflation right now is 1.6%, and we know for sure that's not reflective in LA and Riverside. My concern is that anecdotally, I have talked to about 9 seniors in my walk-arounds the neighborhood, and those seniors are moving. 7 seniors have moved back with their relatives. Only one of those 7 seniors had the eligibility to take a buyout. Another senior right now is negotiating for a buyout and again moving in with relatives. A 9th senior I know doesn't have relatives to move in with, and basically is going through a mental debate whether or not to take a buyout. The article that was distributed to you, which isn't really about Santa Monica, for older Californians, housing crisis, that's really dire. There's an important sentence in that article that I bracketed for all of you, and the sentence reads, "The fixed income of many senior tenants aren't keeping up with even the smaller incremental rent increases." So basically, I'm here to suggest, to recommend a two-tier general adjustment, one for the general population under 62, another adjustment lower, reduced, for the population of renters and rent-controlled units over 62. Basically, being older has financial burdens, just like every generation has financial burdens, but for many seniors, the burdens are more burdensome. And what I would like rent control to do, I know what the process is, Tracy Condon explained it to me, it has to go on the ballot in 2020. And I would like to see a recommendation for a two-tier general adjustment, because if it's really the objective to keep seniors in place, to age in place in their apartments, then it's necessary to make the adjustments more affordable for seniors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Davids. Appreciate your time. Mr. Johnson.
Good evening, Commissioners. Jay Johnson, 9th and Alta. A special thank you both to the board, but in particular Ariel Sakaras, who's just before you, on shepherding through our application to the FEMA organization for the city's request for $9 million of direct grant support to property owners and for the retrofit process, plus $2.5 million for city administration costs. Now, the administration costs can be applied towards plan check review as well as permit fees as separate from actual construction costs. And that's important to keep in mind, because the way that it is written, and had to have been submitted for that matter, is that this applies only to buildings that are 3 stories or more, or 16 units or more. Now that calculates out to roughly 400 buildings in the city out of the 1,600, 1,700 you saw up on the list there. Of those 400, 100 are exempt for one reason or another. The work has been done, et cetera, et cetera. So the money will go towards basically 300 buildings in the city out of the 1,600. That leaves, based on those numbers, roughly 1,100 buildings that need the work done, who theoretically would be entitled to some money at a future cycle from FEMA for additional money for smaller buildings. So right now, it's limited just to 3 stories or more. What could be helpful, and has been very helpful in the past, is for the Rent Control Board to write a letter to City Council supporting the idea of expansion, if possible, of this $2 million or so, $2.5 million in administrative costs that the city will be spending to be able to be used on those other buildings that are not the three stories or not. Plan check fees are roughly $3,000, permit fees are another $3,000. Just to give you an idea, even though the construction cost is anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000 depending on the building. But at least that small portion would be very helpful. Whether the rule could be bent, whether a variance could be issued is a different question. Remember, Congressperson Ted Lieu had written a letter in support of this, which we feel helped with the FEMA people, and I'm sure he would help again. Secondly, you may or may not be aware of the law that was passed last November, signed into law by the governor, regarding wood balconies, deck staircases that are above 6 feet from the ground. This is mandatory. Within the next 5 years, every balcony, deck, and staircase, wood, in the city has to be certified by a structural engineer for its soundness and its integrity, and if not, of course, it has to be either repaired, rebuilt, torn down, etc. That, in effect, in most cases, means you have to submit, on one hand, possibly an architectural review board in some cases, but certainly to a plan check fee, go through that process, as well as the permit fee, assuming unless it's a very, very small one. So that is, again, expensive costs, and perhaps, again, the administration fees could be sent from that. One last sentence, that just to remind the board, it's a friendly reminder that the Rent Control Board sits as a quasi-judicial entity and that on all cases must judge as unbiased and recuse themselves, or certain of them, if they are biased against any party.
Okay, thank you, Mr.
Thank you
Johnson.
very much.
Appreciate your comments, your thoughtful comments
you.
as usual. We actually have a late chit. Can I just accept the late chit? Okay, we have a late chit. Eileen Carey, you have 3 minutes. Hi.
Hi, how are you all? I'm sorry for the late arrival. I have a general comment, if I may. This is a current situation. The Rent Control Board has refused us a hearing for our petition for a properly executed rent decrease petition, which I think is governed by SMR CA 400 and 4001 at Secria. Lynn Nalaboff has refused to state what law she rests this full denial of process on. Instead, she mistakenly believes that we must wait months for an outcome in a separate and unrelated legal process in the higher court. This is incorrect and contrary to law. We find this flat-out refusal to schedule this rent decrease petition hearing unfavorable, prejudicial, and discriminating against tenants and favoring instead the corporate landlord. We are asking the board to make note and take future action so that those similarly situated do not hit the same wall. Thank you.
Is that what the law states? I mean, is there anything that we can do about that, or is that accurate representation of what's happening?
It is accurate that Ms. Carey has filed an application for a rent decrease, and it is accurate that that has not been scheduled for a hearing, because whether Ms. Carey has a tenancy as to which she's entitled to a decrease and whether she's entitled to a decrease as to this issue will be affected by the case that's now in the appellate division of Superior Court.
Okay. Yeah.
And we do have a tenancy because we are in lawful possession, we are paying rent, and I've asked for a legal basis upon which this denial is based. And unfortunately, these repair requests were made 2 years ago.
Okay.
In the whole process.
Sorry,
so
we just don't want,
need it.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Carey. I
Yes,
just
thank you.
wanted to confirm. Thank you for your time. All right, so moving on now to jurisdictional items. Item B, we have a 10A and 10B both deal with owner occupancy exemptions, and I am prepared to move to grant. Right, we have, well, I'm saying 10A is single family dwelling exemption and 10B is an owner occupancy exemption. I'm prepared to grant all three. I think that the staff report was highly thorough and don't see any issues. Do any other commissioners have any comments on that?
I agree. We're the facts are clear in all three cases.
Okay.
The burden has
I
been
wanted to
met.
add- So I note that we have several speakers who
Right.
want to speak on this item, so I would defer to the speakers if they want to be heard, knowing
I was
that
gonna-
the
yeah.
board's inclination. I defer to the chair on how to handle it.
Sure. So I was just about to say, I think, feel that these staff reports are conclusive, but we do have several speakers. Do any of the speakers who signed up still wish to speak, given what we're prepared to do? I see a hand. You would still like to speak? Okay. What is your name? Okay. Please, that's fine. Please approach. I believe that this one is on 10B1. Yeah, so right. Thank you. So let's, how about I move then, in light of the fact that we have someone on 10B to grant. Yeah, you stay there. To grant the single family dwelling exemptions for 10A1 and 2. Do I have a second?
Second.
All right. Can I get a vote?
Commissioner Foster,
Is this on both or one or
This
both?
is on-
Both.
Yes.
Commissioner Duran,
Yes.
Commissioner Phyllis, Commissioner Sultan,
Yes.
and Commissioner Trosas.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Great. Now it appears as though we do have a comment on 10B1. Sorry, Commissioner Phillips, did you want to
Oh.
say something? Okay, so Ileana Navarro.
It looks like they all want to speak.
Yeah, I think that given that it's been pulled from what we were going to do, bypass the staff report, all speakers will be given the opportunity to speak.
Okay, so everyone would like to speak on this item? Do we need to hear a staff report, or do we want to go straight to the speak? Okay, straight to the comments. All right, then, yeah, that's fine. That's in our prerogative. Should I do them in order, or
The appellant
do I
should
need
go
to do them in
first.
order?
Well, the appellant should go first.
Okay. Yeah, you're right. All right, thank you. Santiago Brown, you have 5 minutes.
Or the
So,
applicant,
sorry, you're
I'm
gonna have to
sorry,
go.
the
Yeah, but just stay there.
Hey, good evening, board. My name is Santiago Brown, and I've been been residing at 1760 18th Street, which is considered in the Pico neighborhood. I have resided at this residence for almost a year now, and I want to first thank my mom, Lori, for giving me the opportunity to own and learn as I grow. I really enjoy living in the Pico neighborhood, and I get a real sense of community there. From the Lotte guy to the senior citizens living across the way, everybody's always really nice and really kind. And I know I can count on the other neighbors and all my friends to help me on anything when it comes to projects or such like fixing my car or taking out the trash. And then it's also very convenient that the residence is close to the community college, as I get to go to school and then work from home. As well, sometimes it's really hard for the college students to have a place to relax, so they would like to come to my house, and this is where we hang out and do projects and do a lot of stuff. As well as being a house provider has not always been easy. Keeping the tenants safe is a main priority due to the rise in criminal activity like shootings and robberies in and around the neighborhood. But I've also had the pleasure with working with several departments like the police department and the Metro department to work to fix the wall along the freeway, which was destroyed one night when a drunk driver backed into it, as well as graffiti and shots, which I have installed cameras and was able to help out for all of this. I've requested 5 minutes, but I'd like to reserve the next 3 for the end. So thank you guys for everything so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Zion Ansari, you have 3 minutes. Yeah, I don't. So we have these are all for the applicant. We have Zion Ansari, we have Tom Bolia, and Parker Furlong are the next 3. Okay, Go ahead, Mr. Ansari.
Yeah, hi. So Zion Ansari. I live at 1750 10th Street, and Santiago's my best friend. I've known him for a while, since middle school, and I've just helped him move into the apartment. He's been living there for about a year now, and that's just pretty much our home. That's where I like to stay a lot. I mean, I have my house, but that's my other house. That's my brother. But that's pretty much it. That's it. Is there any questions? Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Ansari. Mr. Bolia.
Hi, how you doing, board? Thank you very much. I live at 1205 Pine Street, Santa Monica. I'm Santiago's adopted dad, and we moved him in there in August last year. And I can tell you that I check his phone regularly to see where he is because he's a kid, and pretty much every night, every week, that's where he is. He's at home, spending his time there. So I just want to make sure unequivocally you all know that that's where Santiago has been living for a long time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Furlong.
Hello, my name is Parker Furlong. I live at 2271 26th Street. When I'm not away at college over the summer, I tend to spend my time with Santiago. I've known him since 6th grade. He's one of my good friends. He does live at that house. I've helped him move in. I've helped him with his projects with his car or just around the house. So that is my knowledge of the situation.
Great, thank you. We have Gavin Louis, or Lai. I'm sorry, that looks like a you. Gavin Lai, and then I think.
Hi, my name is Gavin Lai, and I'm also a good friend of Santi, and I go to school at UC Santa Cruz, but here over the summer and around, I would always come to his house to hang out at his house. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Ileana Navarro, you're next. I don't know if that is not in the order that we have it in. Is this Mateen Tabibian? Okay, he's a late shit. Can we just take him now? Okay, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Mateen Tabibian. I live at 2345 Virginia Avenue. I've known Santi since early high school, 9th grade, and I used to hang out with him all the time, and I still do. We go to the same school, SMC, and yeah, I've been to his house multiple times. He's helped me fix my car, and I've been just hanging out with him. Every once in a while, I go to his place.
Thank you.
No worries. Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Navarro? I believe that she has, you have 3 minutes.
Hi, good evening. My name is Ileana Navarro, and I'm a tenant in Unit A, and I live with my 2 children, my 10-year-old and my 13-year-old, and my husband. I believe this is a tactic my landlord, Lori Brown, is using to increase my rent and taking advantage of the owner occupancy exemption. She has no intention to let her 21-year-old son keep ownership of the property. Also, how is it possible that Ms. Brown's business partner, Tom Beaulieu, gave up ownership of a real estate property without hesitation? If this is a real owner-occupied situation, why isn't Lori Brown moving into the building herself? Ms. Brown's application, if her application is approved, they will raise my rent to an unaffordable price and would create a financial hardship, which would force me to move out in this high rental market. Please take this into consideration. I grew up in Santa Monica, and my kids are attending school, so this is a very stressful situation for me and my family.
Thank you for being here. Thanks for your time. We also have Michael Millman. Did you want to come say anything, Mr. Millman?
I'm submitting on the recommendation.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Millman. So that concludes our public comments. Commissioner Phyllis has a comment.
I just wanted to go on the record and say I think the evidence is really compelling, that it's consistent with the hearing officer's recommendations and findings. I believe that Mr. Brown is residing at the residence. I believe he's been there far beyond the time period required. The record indicates he has an ownership interest. We're not permitted to make discretionary determinations about whether we think it's okay to increase rents, whether we think the impact it's going to have on the tenants. That's just simply not something that we can do as a board. And, when the rent control law was passed, this is one of the core agreements that was struck between the property owner community and the renter community to make rent control sustainable, that for triplexes and duplexes, that owners be eligible to have owner occupancy exemptions. This is exactly what it was intended for. If for some reason Mr. Brown does not reside in the apartment anymore, we have a process in place to determine whether the exemption has lapsed. But for the time being, it looks like he's living there. He's satisfied all the requirements, and we don't have any discretion to deny it. And I wouldn't be inclined to anyway. I think this is exactly what it was designed for. So I'm inclined to grant it.
Thank you, Commissioner Phyllis. Commissioner Foster?
I've always had, comments to make about the owner occupancy exemption and how seriously we take it. And we all read the law. We're fully aware of what can happen and sometimes does and sometimes doesn't happen to prices of tenancies after. It's out of our control. And, sometimes we wish it weren't, but it's completely out of our control. It's not within our purview to decide anything that happens after an exemption is granted. And for the public's edification, there are 3 requirements in every exemption. This landlord has met them, and I am prepared to move that we accept the staff's recommendation to grant the exemption.
Great, thanks. I would agree. I would also say that I don't love granting these. It always is difficult for us. I think we say that every time. But again, just with on the facts and what the law states, I believe we have to go ahead and grant this. Commissioner Duran, did you want to say something?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to reiterate that in this particular case, all the requirements were satisfied by a preponderance of the evidence. That is what we're instructed to look at and to make a determination on. And so I believe that it's a very straightforward case. So I just wanted to make those comments heard, and I'm ready to vote whenever the
Yeah, I made a
board is
motion.
Great. Second that. Mr. Gwynn, do you want to call the roll? We're moving
I
to
made the
grant
motion.
the hearing officer.
Carolyn seconded.
Second, yeah.
Commissioner Duran?
Yes.
Commissioner Phyllis?
Excuse
Yes. Commissioner Sultan? Yes. Commissioner Foster?
Yes.
And Commissioner Terosas?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thanks. Okay, moving on to 10C1. I believe that we will need a staff report on these appeals as they are a little bit more intricate. So can we get a staff report on 10C1 at 1321 Centinela? Thanks.
Certainly, Commissioners. Tenant Seth Talkman filed a rent decrease petition alleging multiple maintenance conditions in his unit and a reduction in housing service because he alleged that the landlord had diminished his right to have roommates to share the rent. The landlord, Mr. Patrick Poon, has only appealed the decrease given for the roommate housing service. Mr. Talkman moved into his unit in 1997 and he had 3 roommates. Within 3 years, his original roommates had vacated, and he executed a new lease with the Poons in which he was the master tenant, responsible for payment of the entire rent. There is no dispute that he has a right to 3 roommates as a housing service of his tenancy. At the outset, the Poons merely required a copy of a government ID of the new roommate before he or she moved in. They never required any further information, which made sense given that Mr. Talkman was responsible for the entire rent. In 2016, Mr. Poon put into place a more formal roommate policy where he asked Mr. Talkman to provide him with the information relevant to do a credit and background check, and that if Mr. Poon did not explicitly communicate his rejection within 14 days, Mr. Talkman was free to add the roommate. Then in April 2018, Mr. Poon added an additional requirement that Mr. Talkman and any potential new roommate must sign a new non-negotiable addendum that concerns Mr. Talkman's responsibility for payment of any temporary or otherwise relocation benefits. Since institution of the latest iteration of the roommate policy, Mr. Talkman has submitted 13 applications. Mr. Poon has rejected all of them without explanation, and he has done so about 13 days after they were submitted. In defense, Mr. Poon stated that he had done so because Mr. Talkman had failed to obtain a minor use permit from the city to have a roommate. Now, the city has never cited either party for failure to have a minor use permit for roommates. There is no evidence in the record of the city ever having done so for anyone, nor is staff aware of such a requirement by the city's Code Enforcement Division, which is actually responsible for enforcement of the city's permit requirements. Mr. Poon also testified that he had rejected the applications because none of the applicants included the rent each would be paying as subtenants, even though Mr. Talkman is responsible for the entire rent to Mr. Poon. Mr. Poon also sought to justify his rejections through extensive testimony on each application. The hearing officer used 3 as illustrative examples. I will briefly go through them. Mr. Nicholas Bruner worked as a bartender and served in a restaurant since March 2015. He moved to Texas for 10 months in 2017, during which time he found work as a bartender for 6 of those months. He's now returned to California, found work as a waiter, and applied to move into Mr. Talkman's apartment. Mr. Poon said he had rejected him because of that gap in his employment history during his stint in Texas. Mr. Chad Eldridge is a chiropractor with a mobile office who earns $10,000 a month and had moved to California from Florida, where he had practiced after going to school there. He submitted a background report confirming his identity and lack of criminal record. Mr. Poon rejected the application because he didn't see how he could have clients both in Florida and California, and because he was self-employed. Mr. Dylan Epperson submitted a payroll stub showing his employment and income, a background report with no criminal record, and a credit report with a very good score. He had lived at the same address for 3 years, but was moving out after breaking up with his girlfriend. Prior to then, he had lived with his family. Mr. Poon rejected the application because he believed his rent-to-income ratio was too high, even though the application didn't state how much rent he would be paying to Mr. Tachman, and because he had lived in his last residence with his family for less than 2 years. While Mr. Bruner's gap in employment history during his stint in Texas may raise concern, even though Mr. Tachman is responsible for the entire rent, one cannot say the same for Mr. Eldridge and Epperson. Since Mr. Poon instituted his new policy last year, he has rejected every single roommate application and has done so by waiting to reject it about 14 days after submission, which further discourages the likelihood of Mr. Tachman getting a roommate. He has rejected applications based on his own self-appointment as the city's code enforcement officer, interpreting the code in a way that the actual code enforcement unit has not. The hearing officer's conclusion that Mr. Poon has reduced Mr. Tachman's roommate housing service is reasonably supported by the record. This board, acting as the appellate body, may overturn that finding only if there is clear evidence of error in the record, which there isn't. That's why staff recommends that the board affirm the hearing officer's decision.
Thank you for that staff report. We have a couple of speakers on this item. Mr. Poon, you have 5 minutes. That large one right there.
This one, I'm sorry. Is there a clock somewhere?
Yes, is it on?
No, I can't tell. There you go. Great, thank you. Good evening, board. Wow. Good evening, board. So I'm here to ask that the decision D5069 by hearing officer Maddie Daub be reversed based on certain facts that she presented that was actually not true. There is evidence, there's no evidence that some of the stuff stated in the original summary of decisions were ever said, even in the records, and those were the basis of the original appeal. For example, on page 33 of the appeal, of the decision that Officer Maddie Daub stated, he rejected outright applicants who did not list long-term prior residency or who had not lived in Santa Monica or its vicinity. There's no record of that ever being said. I'm sure staff vetted everything when I was sending the original appeal. They looked at it, they couldn't find anything, and they didn't say anything to the contrary. Also, in the summary on page 32, Officer Maddie Daub also say, additionally, by Mr. Poon's own admission, he only recently instituted the addendum requirement because Mr. Tachman successfully appealed a city citation regarding relocation benefits affecting one of the former roommates. Mr. Poon's motivation for requiring the addendum appeared to be retaliatory rather than based on a reasonable concern regarding the rights and responsibility of the owner or prospective clients. In the very, very same summary that she gave on page 27, she said that the new addendum was asked for on April 24th. Yet, the Mr. Tachman's appeal for the citation did not happen until June 7th of 2018. There's no possible way that that was a retaliation because I didn't even know what was happening at the appeal. Furthermore, I think she was mistaken because I was at the appeal, not because the citation was issued against me. I was actually the witness for Code Enforcement Officer Frank Cordova, and the city attorney's office had asked me to come in as a witness to be at that appeal hearing. Again, there are facts that are just, at best, alternate facts at this point, because it never happened. You can go through all the records of the entire hearing, and none of those were ever said. I don't know how it got into it, but these were the basis and the foundations of her decision. If you look at she also had a very lack of understanding of actually what the code that governs both Santa Monica Municipal Code in terms of the relocation benefits, because she stated in her summary again, the terms of how the city's relocation benefits could be implemented among the owner, Mr. Talkman, the tenant, and the proposed new tenants, the roommate's tenancy was something that I was trying to modify. Yet it is not. If she actually read the Santa Monica Municipal Code, it actually governs exactly what the relocation benefits are, which I have fulfilled on my behalf. I worked with Aide Gonzalez. I've worked with Officer Frank Cordova from the Code Enforcement Office to make sure that I understood exactly what those codes mean. Yet yet Officer Matty Daub did not understand what that means and incorrectly summarizes that I was trying to reinterpret the code, but it's not. The addendum only states what the code is. It doesn't change a tenancy, it doesn't change anything within that code. Also, if you look at, I was once, a long time ago, here for a council meeting when then Councilwoman Gleam Davis used a sports analogy. So I'm just going to bring that back because I think it's such a good sports analogy that you cannot set up a goalpost and then change it and expect people to be able to make the goal. This is exactly what they're doing with the 14-day window, because that is something that is given owners the right to review any applications. She is basing some of her decision on the fact that not only did may I finish? Not only did I make it through the goalpost, but now I'm being penalized because I made the decision within that time period, but too close to the end. So it's basically saying that the goal doesn't count, or that I'm being penalized because I came too close to the goalpost.
Okay, Mr. Poon, thank you very much for your time. We have Sonia Mulho here. You have, I believe you crossed out 5 and now you have 3 minutes. Is that what's happening here? Right, I know. But is she representing the appellant?
I represent Mr. Talkman.
So why can't she have 5 minutes? Only, okay, the lawyers know. Okay. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you. May it please the commissioners. We had 3 days of hearings in this case. A large part of the extensive testimony was on the issue of Mr. Poon's failure to allow Mr. Talkman to bring in a subtenant when he has the right to have 3 subtenants. In every single one of the 13 or 14, I forget the total number of applications that were submitted, Mr. Poon waited until the very last minute, day 13 or 14, and then sent, if I recall correctly, a simple email saying denied. No reason ever stated. It wasn't until we got to the hearings when all of a sudden he comes up with all these reasons, none of which made any sense or were valid. Mr. Talkman pays the full rent. If the subtenants don't pay rent to him, he's still liable for the full rent. So Mr. Poon has no basis to worry about what the subtenants are paying and their relationship of their income to whatever rent they're paying. There was extensive testimony by Mr. Poon. I did a lot of cross-examination. The hearing examiner asked a lot of questions. She wrote a very detailed decision, which I think correctly states the law. The staff report on appeal correctly analyzes, and I would ask that you affirm the hearing examiner. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Okay, thank you. I do not. Does anyone have questions? Nope. No further questions. I believe that Commissioner Foster, we do not have any other public comment. Commissioner Foster?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. This is pretty simple. There were 2 different sets of reasons given for denying not just 14, but making life very difficult for up to 27 applications for roommates. Changing rules midstream, asserting rules that the tenant did not also agree to midstream. One set of explanations dealing with applicants' suitability, and another set based on a combination of misinterpretation of an MUP and other things to do with city code. There's no question in my mind that this tenant is entitled to have additional roommates, and that this has and that the takeaway, essentially the takeaway of this amenity, has resulted in a substantial reduction of housing services. No question in my mind that we should affirm the hearing officer's decision and deny this appeal.
Thank you, Commissioner Foster. I don't see any other comments, so I'll take the chair's liberty to say that I wholeheartedly agree with that. And actually, I would say moving the goalpost analogy is more apt for Mr. Poon here. So in any event, I would agree with your great analysis, and I would. Did you make the motion?
I did not.
No. Okay. Commissioner Duran would like to say something.
If I could belabor the point, I guess, for just a couple more moments. Even if we assume, and this came to my mind as I was reading this, if we assume for a minute that the hearing examiner cherry-picked the 3 best applicants that were there to put in this report, as compared to the others, they were really good applicants, right? And the flip side of that same coin is, even if they weren't cherry-picked and they were randomly selected, there's still 3 really good candidates, at least in my opinion. And the second thing, which kind of makes me wonder why we're here, is the fact that throughout the whole thing, the tenant was still responsible for 100% of the rent, regardless of what subtenant paid or didn't pay. So I just wanted to make those points. I'm ready.
Great.
Whenever everybody else is.
Thank you, Commissioner Drawn. Is that a motion that I hear?
Yes, that is a motion to affirm the hearing officer's decision and findings of fact and conclusions of law.
Deny the appeal.
And we will deny the appeal.
Correct.
Yes, second that. Can we get a roll call vote?
Commissioner Sultan? Yes. Commissioner Phyllis?
Yes.
Commissioner Foster?
Yes.
Commissioner Duran?
Yes.
And Commissioner Trosis?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Great. Moving on to 10C2. We have the appellant at 2301 31st Street, the Star and the Arrow. Can we please have a staff report?
Commissioners, the appellant tenant, Ms. The Star and the Arrow, submitted new evidence with a written response. They consist of communications with the landlord, her own health records, government agency disclosure form and Q&As regarding mold, statement from the 2016 company that had done the mold report for her, and a statement from her sister. None of this evidence was submitted to the hearing officer. The board reviews this matter as an appellant body, so it may accept this new evidence only if it could not have been provided to the hearing officer through due diligence. That is not the case with any of the evidence, so staff recommends that the board reject their acceptance into the record. I ask that you first make a decision regarding this new evidence.
I don't need to discuss that. I do not think we should appropriately hear any new evidence that was not introduced in the record at the time of hearing.
The rules are the rules. It wasn't introduced in time. We can't hear it. The new evidence.
So, does anyone disagree with that? No. We don't want to hear it.
I shall proceed.
Yes, thank you.
The Star and the Arrow filed a rent decrease petition alleging various maintenance conditions and reductions in housing services. The hearing officer granted some. She has appealed the hearing officer's denial of a rent decrease for mold because she produced a 2016 report that showed its presence in her apartment. She also appears to appeal the denial of a rent decrease for silverfish infestation. She testified that there had been multiple water leaks since she moved into the apartment back in 2013. Her landlord made some repairs in 2014, but she suspected mold in the living room near the bookcases. In March of 2016, she began the practice of placing cardboard on wall space that she believed was damp or infected with mold, and then covering that area with plastic. She said that she had gotten the idea from the internet, where she had read that affected areas need to be barricaded and isolated. She also hired a mold testing company that issued a report in 2016 that found elevated spore levels in the bedroom, bathroom, and living room wall cavity. She did not, however, give the landlord a copy of the report for another 2 years until October 2018 in preparation for filing this petition. Once she told her landlord, he hired a mold testing company to investigate her claims. they did not find elevated spores, but they stated that they could not test the walls for moisture because of the extreme clutter in the apartment. But they did state that even if there is mold inside the walls, it is not escaping because of their testing and does not pose a health risk at this time. The Star and the Arrow also stated that she had contacted the Health Department, the Santa Monica Housing Authority, and the Santa Monica Code Enforcement Division. The record does not show that any of these agencies cited the owner for mold, and she does not claim that they do. The hearing investigator also visited the unit, and she did not observe any visible mold-like substance in the unit. The hearing officer found both parties' mold reports to be of limited evidentiary value absent expert testimony explaining them and the ability of the opposing party to cross-examine such a witness. Moreover, the report from the tenant is 3 years old and the report from the owner is more than 6 months old. No government agency has cited the owner for mold despite her apparent complaints to them, and the petitioner did not provide any evidence that proved that the unit currently suffers from mold or elevated spores. The hearing officer therefore found that she had failed to meet her burden of proving her allegation by a preponderance of the evidence. Again, because this board is an appellate body and can reverse that decision if there's clear evidence of error, and there is none here, the hearing officer's conclusion is reasonable given that record. In her appeal, the tenant it is not clear whether she thinks that the hearing officer erred in not granting her a decrease for alleged silverfish infestation or why she thinks she erred, but what she appears to ask for is a request for a full extermination treatment by the landlord to be repeated in 6 months for silverfish. The board has no authority to order such a treatment. It may only grant a rent decrease if the record proves the infestation by a preponderance of the evidence. Here the record shows that the landlord treated the unit for silverfish in October 2018. The technician, he stated, had told him that the reason for the infestation was likely the extreme clutter in the apartment because silverfish feed on dust and cardboard. The Star and the Arrow testified at the hearing that since she filed her petition in November of 2018, she had observed 5 silverfish over the course of 5 months. The hearing investigator did not observe any. The hearing officer's conclusion that the petitioner had failed to prove an infestation by a preponderance of the evidence is supported by the record. Staff therefore recommends that the board affirm the decision.
Okay, thank you. It appears we have a couple of public comments on this item. The Star and the Arrow, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. I believe I have given more than enough evidence and documentation of the existence of mold in my apartment. I have letters to the owner which I submitted to the hearing board. They did not accept it. I can't understand why. Then there's a rent control Daniela Wadnicki's report that states she smelled a strong earthy odor in the areas that I indicated. The CDC states that large, and that's the CDC, you know what the CDC is, large mold infestation can usually be seen or smelled. Okay, so if you don't smell it, see it rather, because it's in the walls, is still evidenced by smell. The California Department of Public Health states visible water damage, which is throughout my place with cracked walls and ceilings and plaster. The damp materials, visible mold, and mold odor, again, the mold odor indicates an increased risk of respiratory disease, which I have had recurrent bronchitis, runny noses, itchy eyes, sore throat, allergic rhinitis, as well as headaches and heart palpitations, which I didn't have the heart, all of that before I moved in. I have a drainage tube in this ear because of the station tube, because of the allergies, has closed. Now, some of this was not admitted to evidence. I have a stack of medical reports, was not admitted to evidence. So I can't be responsible for that not being in the evidence thing. There is the CDC also states there is this constructive thing where the owner, any reasonable person, should know just from the conditions of the apartment. So even if I didn't give him the letters, which I did, just from the conditions of the apartment, any reasonable person would be able to have knowledge of the mold. Actual knowledge is when the landlord is told either through a tenant, repairman, or through their own investigation that mold exists on the property. Such instances the landlord will be charged with a notice. They're also held liable when they fail to inform future or prospective tenants of the existence of mold. So there's that on the CDC. Mold disclosure requires in California. Okay, we're not going to give up on this. When you have mold, even though it's a 3-year mold report, it doesn't go bad. You have mold on cheese. If you cut the moldy part off, you can eat the cheese, but in my case, the moldy part has not been remediated. It's still there. It continues to grow like mold on cheese if left in the right circumstances, which in my apartment, there's always leaks everywhere. So the Santa Monica Housing Authority, the city attorney, code compliance, health department would not touch this. They told me, even though they have codes on their books, that they will not touch the mold. So how can I be responsible for having reports from these organizations? That's not my fault. They don't do the stuff. That's what they say, but each one turned me on to the next one. The damage in my unit is indicative of water damage, and I proved that on the CD and the pictures that I presented, so this is not new stuff. The hearing officer ignored Danielle Wojnicki's report that's from the rent control that states strong earthy smell in certain areas where the mold, I said, was. So the housing that I don't have available for me because it's cluttered, because I can't put things against the wall where the mold is, because I had all my boxes of family pictures on the bedroom wall on the bottom where all the mold is. They're all affected. Okay, this isn't just light stuff, and it stinks. I put something else there, it's affected. I change the stuff on the walls periodically because it's affected, and Daniela Wojnicki smelled it, so she's aware of that. But the hearing officers ignore that. And a few other things. So I think on the basis of that, I am deserving of a rent reduction. I can't use part of my apartment like I normally would if it wasn't for the mold. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kutrumbis, you have 3 minutes. I don't believe that we can hear that because it was not in the record at the time of the hearing officer's determination, and we are
This
not
is an
here
appeal, not a
right,
hearing.
Exactly. We're here as an appellate body. We can only hear evidence that was in the record at the time of the hearing officer's determination.
Okay, there is. She did the report.
Is that in the record?
Yes.
The report itself is in the record, but she did not testify at the hearing.
Okay.
So the report continues to be in the record before the board.
So did you put in my question is, did you put in a chit? If what? Yeah. So
Jacqueline Resnick.
So Mr.
Kutrumbis.
Are you just asking for Ms. Resnick to go before you in time?
Correct.
Not to change the record?
No.
Okay, well, you can testify on this matter, but you cannot offer any new evidence that was not in the record at the time.
Yeah, I think he just was changing where he wanted to go in. Well, it's in our discretion.
Excuse me, ma'am, sorry, we're only hearing...
My recommendation is not to accept the testimony of the mold expert because she did not testify. The entire sum of her contribution is in the report.
Okay.
So unless she's just going to simply read the report that has already been written, there's nothing that she can say that wouldn't be new evidence.
Okay, I am very, very reticent to tell someone that they can't testify at an open hearing. So I disagree with that. I have no objection to Ms. Resnick going before Mr. Kutrumbis. That's the only issue. But please know you can't add anything that's not in the
just
record.
a quick question. Are we referring to pages 6 through 8 in the packet here? Is that what she's going to be testifying to? Is this the old report? Yeah, sorry. Do we have a copy of her report in front of us? Right. So I don't know that there's additional evidence that we need to Excuse me, that we cannot hear additional evidence, so I don't understand what she would be testifying to.
You.
Are you going to read what's in the report? You can't clarify, but you can read what's in the report. Okay, that's fine. Does anyone else have an issue with letting her talk? Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
I agree with Commissioner Phyllis. I understand and I'm aware of the gray line that's in front of us, but she's put in a chit to speak. I think so long as she limits herself to
what's already in the record,
clarifying what she's explained in her testimony, I don't see that that's new information. I'm okay with her speaking.
Okay, Ms. Resnick, you have 3 minutes, and please limit yourself to what's already in the record.
Thank you. Simply, I was the person that performed the inspection, and in the report and in the record, when I entered the property, it was completely full. The contents were everywhere. There were not many walls that were accessible whatsoever. She did explain that she had an issue with wall cavities and whatnot. I couldn't get to them. However, I was able to test the air and I was able to perform inspection of the rest of the unit that I could access in the living room and in the bedroom. From what I was able to access, again, the air samples, as evidenced in the report, does show that the ambient air that they're exposed to, that she is breathing on a consistent basis, had absolutely acceptable levels of mold. There were not elevations of anything. There was not toxic elevations. The levels were acceptable in that unit. The situation with the wall cavities, mold is present 100% of the time everywhere on Earth. We're all breathing it right now. It's harmless. It's perfectly safe, as it was in that unit.
Okay, sorry, you can't.
It's in the report.
Okay.
Verbatim.
We're not drawing any conclusions here.
No, I'm not.
Okay.
I'm simply stating that whether or not there's concern of something in a wall cavity, which is also in the report, there is always something that can be found if we dig enough in cavities. If it's not escaping a wall and you're not physically exposed to it and you're not breathing it, it cannot harm you. Just the same way as in a biology class, if it's a day where they pass a brain around in a bottle of formaldehyde so everybody can look at it, or anything else in formaldehyde, we can all touch it, we can all pass it around. It can't hurt us because it's trapped in that jar. Mold in a wall cavity, if it is not escaping, in writing in here, cannot harm anybody. If it cannot escape the wall, it does not harm anybody. Her walls, she did have covered in plastic and cardboard. All of her belongings were covered. You had to have a skinny path to get through anything. So if there is elevated moisture, she's potentially trapping it between the contents and the walls. So, as I said, without adding anything new, the mold levels, there was nothing visible, there was nothing growing on any of the surfaces, there was nothing airborne. It was simply trapped in a wall. There's probably mold in these walls, but as long as it doesn't come out, it cannot harm anybody.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. All right, great. Thank you, Ms. Resnick.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Kutrubis.
Yes, hello. There were two issues with the apartment, the mold and the silverfish. I have a pest control company that goes by whenever is an issue, which I hire them. They were by, if you want to see the report again. And they state that because the apartment has so much clutter, dust and boxes all over, and that's where the silverfish feeds on, or maybe it was brought in by the boxes and whatever she has on the floor. But I did hire the company, and I will have them go by again and spray whenever it's needed, as long as she tells me. And everybody went by, nobody seems to be finding any mold. The health department went by, rent control went by, did an inspection, Section 8 did the inspection. Everything passed. I have the inspection here from Section 8, if you like to look. There is no violations, no cracks on the walls, no anything. So any repair she requests, I do immediately. but she never calls me. Instead of calling me to go and do the repair, she will call the health department, she will call rent control, she will call every agency in the city, and they notified me for the repairs. She never does. I don't know why, but if I don't know something needs to be repaired, I cannot go in and out her apartment. If she calls me, I'm there immediately. And I've been doing this the last 40 years. I never had another tenant complain about anything for me before.
All right. Faristopoli. All right. Okay. I don't think we have any more comments. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Gwynn, did she have more time? I don't believe. I'm inclined to say 20 seconds is fine. Would you like to speak for 20 seconds?
Evidence, a bunch of pictures regarding the mold and the cracks and the cracks and everything. The field for fish and mold and water go hand in hand. Okay, that's everybody knows that. The owner's report was partial. Mine was complete. The stuff against the wall that should be against the wall is in the middle of the floor. I have pictures here of before and after, which I submitted to on a CD. This is water against the wall outside the apartment. This is a picture of me and my kids, totally wet with moisture. Okay, this man is coming up with all kinds of stories. The walls were accessible. They opted not to because it was expensive. All right, I'm not able to use the walls because of the smell which comes through the walls.
Okay, thank you, Star and Arrow. All right, I believe we have no further comments on this item, so Commissioner Phillips, please proceed.
I move to, I think this is ripe for a motion, move to accept the deny the appeal and affirm the findings of facts and conclusions of law.
I would second that. Commissioner Foster, did you want to make a comment? Okay. Any further comments from other commissioners? All right, I second the motion.
Commissioner Phyllis. Commissioner Duran?
Yes.
Commissioner Foster?
Yes.
Commissioner Sultan? Yes. And Commissioner Trosas?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. All right, moving on to 10C3. We have 933 6th Street, Unit 1, Appellant N. Gobriel. Can we have a brief staff report?
Commissioners, McKelly Laurent moved into her apartment back in August of 2010. Her lease stated that her rent was $1,850. It also stated that there is a monthly fee of $55 for water and trash and parking for $100 if available. It is undisputed that Ms. Laurent only paid $1,850 during the initial lease term, and under the rent control law, that means that $1,850 is her initial base rent and the basis for all her future MARs. Every year since she's moved in, her landlord, Nassif Gobrail, served her with rent increase notices. Some years, those notices mentioned utility charges. Occasionally, they mentioned parking charges. Other years, they were silent to both, and then there were years in which the notices said that one or the other charge had been waived. Ms. Laurent said that she found the notices confusing, but didn't suspect that they were inaccurate until last year when she received a notice that a parking fee would be assessed at $200 and utilities for $110. When she concluded that she'd been overcharged rent, she filed an excess rent petition for the period of November 2015 to October 2018. The hearing officer found that Mr. Gobrail's initial rent increase notices were correct and based on an $1,850 base rent. She also found that water and trash and parking were housing services of Ms. Laurent's tenancy. Between 2013 and 2014, the hearing officer found that the landlord collected an additional amount of rent for utilities in excess of the MAR. Because the hearing officer concluded that Mr. Gobrail had done so knowingly and had yet to repay Ms. Laurent for having done so, she excluded the annual general adjustments in calculating Ms. Laurent's MAR going forward from that date as per board regulation. Because Mr. Gobrile had charged Ms. Laurent the GA increases for those years, and more recently charged additional amounts for utilities and parking, the hearing officer found that he had collected excess rent and ordered it to be reimbursed with interest. Mr. Gobrile has appealed the decision, but he didn't appeal most of the excess rent for which he was found liable. Instead, he objects to the hearing officer's conclusion that parking was a housing service of Ms. Laurent's tenancy, and he takes issue with the hearing officer's consideration of a 2004 excess rent decision in concluding that Mr. Gobrile knowingly charged Ms. Laurent excess rent in 2013, which led to the blocking of the GAs for the subsequent years. Finally, Mr. Gobrile also takes issue with the fact that the hearing officer excluded the GAs in 2014 and 2015 when the rent increase notices for those years were inaccurate due to small mathematical errors. In his appeal, Mr. Gobrile first asked for a de novo hearing. Now, the board has a discretion to hold a de novo hearing in which it would conduct the hearing in the same manner as its hearing officers. But there's nothing exceptional about this hearing that would warrant it. Mr. Gobrile's reason for urging a whole new hearing held by the board is because he believes that the hearing officer's decision is erroneous because of errors in facts or law. That is as it is with any other appeal. Staff therefore recommends that the board deny this request and consider the appeal based on the record that was developed. As to the parking issue, Ms. Laurent stated that she parked in space 2 since the beginning of her tenancy. Mr. Gobrile said that couldn't have been because he said that the space was assigned to Ms. Boveda, who was then the tenant of Unit 2, except that Ms. Boveda said that she never had a parking space and that Ms. Laurent had always parked in the rear since she had moved in. Ms. Laurent's son also testified and confirmed that his mom had always parked in the rear. 5 neighbors also submitted affidavits supporting Ms. Laurent's claim, and it is undisputed that Ms. Laurent only paid $18.50 rent despite having parked in the rear in Space 2 since the outset of her tenancy. Therefore, the hearing officer reasonably concluded that parking was a housing service of her tenancy. Mr. Gobrile argues that such a conclusion is unlawful because her lease said otherwise, and that contracts must be interpreted based on the mutual intent of the parties and preferably from the written provision of the lease. But this case is not about enforcing the lease. It's about whether something is a housing service under the rent control law. The lease is one piece of evidence, and a preponderance of the evidence supported the hearing officer's conclusion. As to the 2004 decision, the hearing officer relied on it in part in concluding that Mr. Gobrile had knowingly collected excess rent. If an owner does so knowingly, board regulations exclude the historical annual general adjustments in calculating the MARs for the years that are at issue in an excess rent petition. The hearing officer based her conclusion on the fact that Mr. Gobrile has owned and managed multiple rent control properties in Santa Monica, and his rent increase notices show a clear understanding of the MAR, how to calculate and apply the GA, fees, and surcharges, and to attach a property tax bill to allow for pass-through of certain surcharges. The hearing officer also relied on a 2004 decision that found that Mr. Gobrile willfully accepted and retained excess rent, employing a pattern in which he claimed rent that was higher than the amount actually paid by the tenant, both in the rental agreement and in the vacancy unit registrations that he filed. Quite similar to this case, hence its relevance to the hearing officer's query. Mr. Gobrile says that the hearing officer shouldn't have relied on that decision because he was not the property owner. It is true that at the time of the case, his brother was the owner, but Mr. Gobrile had owned that property, had transferred it through transactions that the board found suspicious, and at the time of the case was the property manager and the registered agent. That here he also filled out vacancy registration forms that claimed a higher rent than that actually paid by the tenant makes that 2004 decision very relevant and reasonably relied upon by the hearing officer in reaching her conclusion. Finally, the hearing officer correctly excluded the GAs for the years 2014 and 2015 in calculating the current MARs because even though the rent increase notices for those years were basically accurate, but for slight mathematical errors, in 2013, the year prior, Mr. Gobrile had knowingly collected and retained an additional $55 a month for utilities in excess of the MAR, and when it became 2014 and 2015, he still had not reimbursed Ms. Laurent for having collected that excess rent. Therefore, the board's regs direct that the GAs be excluded for those years independent of the fact that the increased notices were more or less accurate. For these reasons, staff recommends that the board affirm the hearing officer's decision.
Quick question. Do you have a copy of the initial lease? I didn't see it in our packet. Thank you. While he's getting that, we have the appellant representative, Mr. De Jesus. You have 5 minutes.
Yes. Good evening, Chair and board members. Jason De Jesus of Parker Milliken, representing appellant Nassif Gabriel, owner of 933 6th Street. This case is based on a clear, unambiguous rental agreement that does not provide a parking space to the tenant. The lease states, vehicles and parking. Owner reserves a right to control parking. A parking space can be provided for a $100 monthly fee if needed and if available. Appellant filed this appeal because the hearing officer's decision that the tenant-based rent included a parking space and that the amounts paid for parking constitute excess rent not only is contrary to the law and evidence, but it would result in appellant needing to provide parking spaces to more tenants than the number of parking spaces available, or to reduce those tenants' monthly rent. Appellant has conceded certain issues not raised on appeal, but the hearing officer's decision that parking is a base amenity changes the bargain and has ramifications across the board that don't make any sense. The hearing officer's decision must be overturned. Appellant respectfully requests a de novo hearing for 2 main reasons. First, the hearing officer's conclusion that Ms. Liran's base rent includes a parking space and the hearing officer's reason for that conclusion run contrary to the law and the rental agreement's unambiguous language. And 2, in assessing appellant's credibility and in finding that the appellant knowingly collected excess rent, the hearing officer erred on material facts when she heavily relied on a 15-year-old excess rent decision involving a property that appellant did not own. The unambiguous language in the rental agreement provides no right to parking, and tenants' parking payments corroborates that agreement. As a matter of law, the lease governs the relationship between tenant and appellant. An agreement establishing a landlord-tenant relationship is a contract, and it's subject to the rules governing the interpretation of contracts. The provision in the lease confirms tenant and appellant's intent that parking was not included as a base amenity. The hearing officer's conclusion that parking is a base amenity of tenant's unit defies the fundamental rules of contract interpretation and contradicts tenant and appellant's clear intent that parking was not included in the base rent as expressed in the rental agreement. Moreover, the rental agreement contains no language that would even suggest that appellant was required to provide a parking space to the tenant. The agreement even states no oral agreements have been entered into, and this agreement shall not be modified unless such modification is reduced to writing. Ms. Liran offered no evidence of a signed writing modifying that rental agreement. Notably, Ms. Liran paid $100 per month for parking from September 2017 to September 2018. Her parking payments conform to the rental agreement. It defies common sense to believe that Ms. Liran started paying extra for parking in the middle of her lease term and continued to do so for more than 1 year, despite her alleged belief that her monthly rent included parking. Contracts must be interpreted based on the mutual intent of the parties, and such intent is to be inferred solely from the written provisions of the contract if possible. The hearing officer's conclusion that base rent included a parking space violates the clear and plain language of the rental agreement, and it leads to an unfair and unreasonable result that the parties could not have possibly intended when they signed the rental agreement, which would require appellant to provide more parking spaces than he possesses. Lastly, the hearing officer erred in relying on a 15-year-old decision to judge the appellant's credibility and to conclude that the appellant knowingly collected excess rent. That 15-year-old excess rent decision involved a property that appellant did not own. Because the hearing officer's improper assessment of appellant's credibility plainly permeated the entire decision, we believe a de novo review is appropriate. On page 22 of the hearing officer's decision, the hearing officer analyzes appellant's credibility and took administrative notice of the 15-year-old decision. The hearing officer asserted 3 findings, the most important of which is, in that prior case, appellant was found to have willfully accepted and retained excess rent. Based on those findings in the prior case, the hearing officer stated appellant's familiarity with the RCL and its requirements severely undercuts his explanations. However, not only is that 15-year-old decision 15 years old, but it relates to a different property that appellant did not own. For those reasons alone, the hearing officer's reliance on that decision is improper. The entire decision was based on an improper assessment of appellant's credibility. Accordingly, the hearing officer's decision must be overturned, including the exclusion of the general adjustments for 2013 to 2018. I object to any testimony subsequent to mine that does not relate to evidence that was not submitted for the case.
Thank you for your testimony. Oh, yep, go ahead.
What's your authority for requesting a de novo hearing?
Do
Do you have a reg?
There's a board regulation stating that it's upon the board's discretion to grant a de novo hearing.
It's on discretion.
8059.
If
Yeah, no, I know. But what is your best argument, I guess?
That there's, it's two arguments that the lease is clear and plain that it did not provide any parking to the tenant, and also that the tenant's credibility that was assessed by the hearing officer was based on a decision that did not relate to the tenant.
I think he's trying to say it's a clearly erroneous decision.
Yes.
My question for council, under 8059, if we grant the appeal and then reverse back, that's the hearing officer holds the de novo hearing, right? I'm trying to understand. We hold, right? Well, no. That's my question.
Yes, the
I'm a little
board has
confused.
the right to hold a hearing, which it would do as though it were the hearing examiner.
At this exact moment.
Normally, what would happen in this situation is notice would be provided because people may have witnesses and
Right.
other things.
That's my question. That's my point. Is I'm a little confused about what I've never seen this done before ever. It's never been done. Okay.
Yeah, that's something that the board has the right to do, but I'm not aware that it has ever done it, but
Okay.
it could do it if it thought that there was a need to do so.
And I'm assuming there. So I agree that if we are remotely considering it, there should be notice and an opportunity to be heard.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. De Jesus. Miss Laurent, I think is, or I don't, Mikhail Laurent. Yeah.
This is my son, Axel, and this is one of the tenants that lives in apartment 2. Okay, so when I moved in, I was assigned, he showed me my parking spot, laundry, he showed me the property. This is where I'm going to park. So however he worded that contract, he did so in knowing that it could leave it to a precarious situation where it could be interpreted whatever way. So he's really just setting me up to do exactly what he did now by increasing. And I'm not the only tenant. So it's just a matter of time when other tenants step up here and deal with the same situation as me. So in doing so, after I filed for a excess of rent, within 2 months after that, or 3 months after that, he seized my parking. So now I am without parking on the street. And the parking, I would have never moved into this place if I didn't have parking. I need my parking. It is so crowded right now on that street that, like the other night, I drove around for a half an hour looking for parking and had to park in the back where he's pinpointing me out, singling me out to not have to remove my car or he'll tow it. There's no parking. Some people take 2 spots. I would have never moved into this place. I came from a place where I had 2 parking spots. Moved into this place, I had 1. I would always establish that. So based on however you want to base it, I was assigned a parking spot from day 1. And stayed there for 7 years until he built an illegal enclosed garage in the back. Then he changed us around. So no permit on that built garage. That put in, may I just add really quickly, he takes up 9 spots. He has 4 spots in the front with garages that are filled. He built that enclosed garage in the back that has 2 spots, that's 6. He seized my parking and he's left his car there and hasn't moved it. So there's 7. And then he has a disability parking spot in front of the building, which he hoards because he always puts one of his cars in there. So that's 8. And then there are additional car just on the public street. So this man is taking up a lot of parking. So that's all.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
We also have Axel Laurent.
Okay. I would just like to say I'm very nervous right now. Guys, I feel like it's a big deal. I would like to point out that the supposed unambiguous lease, it did state that the owner can do whatever he wants with the parking, which I guess would make it kind of more ambiguous than not. I will say that I always remember my mom would sometimes pick me up from school. I'd always park in the very right spot in the back. Regarding the 2017, I think around like September, where she did pay $100, she was dealing with a tumor, and she didn't want to fight with him, so she just agreed and just paid the $100 because I mean it was like a pretty huge tumor. What else? Okay, yeah, I like to reserve if I think about something else.
Okay, thank you. Joe Lamas.
Good evening. My name is Joe Lamas. I'm a vice president here at Merrill Lynch. And the reason I'm here is to support Ms. Laurent's claims and to validate what she says. I've been in the complex since 2015, and since that time, Ms. Laurent had a parking space assigned to her. When I moved in, I was also assigned a parking space, and later, Mr. Gabriel said that he had not assigned a parking space. However, my contract clearly indicates that it is, but this is not about me, this is about her. So, fact is that I saw that she had a parking spot, a designated parking spot. She parked there. Fact is that this gentleman has occupied all the parking spaces, mostly all of the parking spaces for him and his family, leaving maybe 2, 3 available for a 9, 12 unit apartment. I'm not sure how many units there are. In any case, he occupies about 9 or 10 of those spaces. The garages that he has in front are supposed to be, I think, for the tenants. But again, those garages, as she pointed out, are filled up with what some people might call stuff and others might call junk. And so they're not available. Mr. Gabriel also, without any advance notice, decided that he wanted to build a garage where the parking spaces were in the rear, where the alley is. So he basically told me, and I live with my mother. My mother moved in with me. She's an 84-year-old woman who suffers from diabetes, and I don't want to. It's not a sob story for empathy here, but it's again the issue that these spaces, which are supposed to be for the tenants, are being all used up by Mr. Gabriel and his family. And the other issue, of course, is the garage. He kicked us out and moved it. Well, in my case, he moved me to another space, which is a lot smaller and is not really supposed to be a covered space, and it's not. It's partially covered. And so basically, Again, I'm just attesting to and validating what Ms. Leonard said.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Lamas. We have no further comments on this item. We'll move to comments by our commissioners. Commissioner Foster.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to ask staff a question quickly and then make a comment. So in the portion of the staff report where we talk about the hearing officer's finding that parking is a housing service of Ms. Laurent's tenancy, could you, because it's not explained sometimes as clearly as it can be, can you explain the basis upon which the hearing officer can arrive at that conclusion in this case in more detail?
Yes. The board, the hearing examiner first, and now the board in this appeal, is not interpreting or enforcing a contract. It's applying the rent control law. The board, in other contexts, particularly excess rent contexts, has often noted situations in which a landlord has entered into a lease with a tenant that says the rent is, say, $3,000 a month, but they have some understanding that the tenant's really going to pay $2,500 a month, and then something happens between the landlord and tenant, and they charge more, and they say, well, the lease says the rent is this higher amount. The charter, however, says that the maximum allowable rent is the amount that's actually charged. The base rent is the amount actually charged and accepted from the landlord. So, although the lease may say something different, and if the board were a court sitting as a civil court interpreting a contract, it might say, yes, you had this contract to do X, Y, and Z, but that's not what the board is doing. It's applying the rent control law. Here, a person pays rent for the things that are actually provided in connection with their tenancy. The evidence here was, as you've just heard, that parking was actually provided from the beginning of this person's tenancy. So what was actually provided was what they were actually paying for. The fact that the lease may have said, oh no, I'm not actually providing this thing that I am actually providing, is neither here nor there. Is that responsive to your question?
It is, very much so. I also remember other examples where there's been a cat in the apartment for 15 years, but the lease said no pets, but there's a clear path to keeping the cat. So I've read this thoroughly. I actually conferred with staff, since the report was issued a week ago, to further understand the issues more deeply. I am completely convinced that an experienced landlord, whether they owned the property in 2004, example, or not, who owns and has managed multiple units in multiple buildings in Santa Monica for multiple years, knows that it's highly irregular to charge extra for water and trash, to switch around charges for parking and take and give parking spaces. This feels like a manipulation to me. And so I agree that Part A, there is no basis for de novo hearing in this matter. I also agree with the staff report in Part B that the hearing officer's finding that parking is a housing service of her tenancy is reasonably supported by the record. I further agree that the hearing officer did not err in relying on the 2004 decision, and that the historic exclusion of the annual general adjustment in 2014 and 15 for calculating the maximum lawful rent is in full accordance with the board's regulations. And I would move that we affirm the hearing officer's decision and findings of fact and conclusions of law and deny this appeal. That's my motion.
Commissioner Phyllis. Commissioner Phyllis, would you like to make a comment?
Yep, just that I think the standard of review is extremely deferential here. There has to be no reasonable basis in the record for us to reject the determination of the hearing examiner. Here, I think there are a multitude of grounds on which we can affirm the hearing examiner's decision, including the fact that I think the provision in the contract may be illusory as to the parking. And I think I agree with Commissioner Foster's motion, and I second it. And I move to call the vote.
Okay. I don't believe he had a remaining 30
No, he just went
seconds.
off.
You used all of your time.
Sure, whatever.
I don't recall.
If you
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that that's at our discretion, and you've already, no. Do you want to give him the 30 seconds? Okay, fine. I'm fine with giving the 30 seconds.
Thank you, and I appreciate the Commissioner and the Board. The factual findings were based on the assessment of appellant's credibility. Whether or not, and whether Ms. Lorand parked in that space was based on testimony. The hearing officer chose which side to believe based on her assessment of the credibility, and that was based on a clearly erroneous reliance on a 15-year-old decision.
Okay, thanks. Although, again, I think we've moved that it's not clearly erroneous, and I think that the hearing officer is entitled to assess the credibility of those testifying at the hearing. So I think that that's within their purview. But thanks for your additional comment. I think we're ready for a vote. I would agree that the parking terms were quite ambiguous in the lease, but I don't even think that that's here or there. I think it's undisputed that she paid $18.50 for the entire term of the first year of the lease, and therefore that was the base rent charged and accepted by the landlord. And I'm prepared to move with the roll call vote here.
Commissioner Duran.
Yes.
No,
we're
I
voting.
mean,
It's over.
we're voting.
No, it's over. We're voting. Huh?
Yeah, I mean,
discussion's closed.
No, the discussion's closed.
Yeah, I
and
think the record is set. Council's obviously created a record. I move to call the vote.
I voted yes. You had called my name.
Commissioner Foster?
Yes.
Commissioner Phyllis? Commissioner Sultan? Yes. And Commissioner Trosas?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you.
I was afraid of the retaliatory move by him. So I'm bringing this up because I'm going to be watching him very closely for any retaliatory action that he takes.
If there are issues with that, we have staff available again to counsel you, and there is a city attorney tenant harassment ordinance here. So, we have laws to protect people, and our information coordination staff can talk to you about that. That's not public information. Public information. All right. All right. Moving on to 10C4. We have 1760 18th Street, Unit A, appellant L. Brown. Can we have a brief staff report? Very brief.
I'll do my best, Commissioner. Commissioners, when Ileana Navarro moved into her apartment in 2010, the property was exempt as an owner-occupied property. Her initial rent was $1,500, and she paid that for the duration of her tenancy under the old landlord. When the old landlord died, the exemption lapsed by operation of law, and the property's title passed to a trust, and that trust registered Ms. Navarro's tenancy as $1,500 with a reference in the registration form to Givoni, the court case that found that a base rent for the tenancy of a once exempt property is established when the exemption lapses. Ms. Lori Brown bought this property in 2014. Ms. Brown tried to re-register Ms. Navarro's tenancy on several occasions based on a theory that the initial base rent for Ms. Navarro's tenancy was what she had initially paid in 2010, from which the current MAR would then be calculated based on all the subsequent GAs. Staff rejected her re-registrations because the tenancy had already been registered and because the initial base rent under rent control was the rent she paid when the property became subject to rent control again in 2013. GAs, therefore, are not applied to that initial base rent until the year following when it became subject to the rent control law. Despite communications from the board that Ms. Navarro's actual MAR based on the 2013 initial base rent, Ms. Brown collected a higher rent based on application of GAs to an initial rent of $1,500 going back all the way to 2010. Ms. Navarro eventually filed an excess rent petition, and the hearing officer found in her favor. Ms. Brown has appealed that decision. She argues that the board's method of calculating a tenancy's MAR after the lapse of an exemption, which was codified by the board in Regulation 2007, violates the court's decision in Birkenfeld and Vega. Neither case are relevant. Birkenfeld does not concern itself with the question of the date on which a unit's initial base rent is established, nor whether general adjustments must be retroactively applied to a period of non-control in order to determine a unit's current controlled MAR. Instead, Birkenfeld held that a rent control law cannot require a landlord to apply to rent board for permission to initiate eviction, and the law can't require every landlord who wants to impose an annual rent increase to first apply for permission from a rent board before doing so. Neither of these holdings are at issue here. Vega considered a West Hollywood ordinance that allowed landlords to apply for an increase in a unit's MAR if the base rent ceiling was disproportionately low. This is not at issue here. There is nothing disproportionate about a $1,500 monthly rent for a one-bedroom apartment in 2013. The median for the area of the city at the time was $1,590. In Vega, the landlord had not raised her rent on her tenants for over a decade, and they were low to begin with. Under Giovoni and the board's regulations, Ms. Navarro's base rent ceiling was established when her unit first became controlled in October 2013. Since she paid $1,500 in rent at that point, that is the basis for all future MARs. Because Ms. Brown charged more than the MARs for the years at issue in this case, she charged excess rent, as the hearing officer concluded. Staff therefore recommends that the board affirm her decision.
Thank you for that. We have several. Okay, Rosario Perry, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Rosario Perry. There's no facts in dispute. The problem is your regulation 2007 is ultra vires. Okay, which means it's not supported by the charter. The charter says that what the base rent shall be. The charter also says at 1803F that the board has the power to establish the base rent, okay, has the power to establish the base rent based on 1804B. You don't have the power to establish a MAR. A MAR is a calculated amount based on the base rent. You can establish how much percentage increase you want to give each year, and that will set the MAR from year to year, but you don't have the authority under the charter to establish a MAR. What's crazy about this case is you don't have a base rent for this unit. This is what I got so upset about. You have to have a base rent for a unit before you can establish a MAR. The base rent is what is established by 1804B. Now, 1804B, because of Giovoni, had to be changed a little bit. But the difference between Giovoni and your 1804B in this case is this case has never been controlled until the lady died, right? That was the first time it was controlled. So what happens is this. Vegas says that the base rent, not the MAR, no one's talking about a MAR, we're talking about a base rent. What's the base rent for this unit? They won't answer. The staff will not answer that question. How can you have a MAR without a base rent? Anyway, Vegas says when you establish a base rent, it has to be proportionate to the rents in the area. The council just told you the proportionate rent is $1,590. We established a base rent at $1,600. It's $10 difference. But the way we established the MAR and the base rent was this way. We say the first rent you pay when you come in could be the base rent, conceivably, and you get the annual general adjustments each year. And we think that the annual general adjustments would be a good indication of the increase, the general increase in rents throughout the city. So if you got a $1,500 a month starting rent in 2010, and you apply, and you say that's the base rent, I think you have to do that, and you apply the AGAs, you're going to get $1,600 in October of 2013 when the poor lady died. That's all it is. And we're not trying to pull anything over anybody's eyes, but if you do it your way and you take 2007 and try to apply it, you're not even establishing a MAR, a base rent. You pull a MAR out of the air. You can't do that. You don't have the authority to do that constitutionally, under the charter. You only have the authority to set a base rent. So let's say you want to set a base rent. In fact, what's so funny about this opinion, is that the hearing officer creates a new term. She creates a term called base MAR. She says the base MAR is going to, well, where does that come from? Of course, it comes from nowhere. It comes from a realization, though, that she needs a base. She needs the base rent, and she knows it, and she can't go with our explanation, so she makes up this term called base rent. I think that's at page 6. I don't remember what the page is on, but it's there. So let's just recap. Vega, first of all, you have a charter, you got to follow it. We voted the charter. You get to vote regulations, but the regulations have to be supported by the charter. The charter says you have the authority to establish a base rent pursuant to 1804B. 1804B says the base rent will be the first rent charged after the unit becomes controlled. The problem is Giovanni and Vega have modified that, and they say the base rent will have to be a rent that's consistent, equal to a fair in relationship to all the other rents. How do you get that? Well, that's what you should have had a hearing on, and that's what we tried to introduce. We tried to tell you that the fair rent under Vega, because Vega, that's what Vega requires, the fair rent would be $1,600, and that's fair. It's $10 off of what the actual average rents are in the neighborhood. But the way we did it is we did it a very reasonable way. We said, okay, the first rent she paid when she moved in was $1,500, 2010. We'll call that the base rent. There's no reason not to call that the base rent. That's the first rent she paid. We'll take the annual general adjustments. That will equal the normal increases that the market would give a person. Not accurate, not 100% accurate, but pretty good way to do it. So the MAR is going to be, of course, when it's controlled, $1,600.
Thank you, Mr. Perry.
Thank you.
While I'd love to get into a legal argument with you, I'll refrain. Yeah, Commissioner Phyllis.
Why do you want to refrain? What else is there to do tonight?
I just want to understand, is your argument that there was no base rent, that's your argument, despite the fact that it was registered in 2013 at $1,500? I just want to make sure that the record is completely clear.
That is yes, because what was registered in 2013 by someone was the MAR based on Giovanni, and that is old law. You can't register a MAR until you have a base rent established. There was never a base rent
So it's your position there was never a base rent?
Well, and it's true, but it is
Okay.
my position.
Okay.
Because
It's his position that any owner occupancy exemption that lapses can just be.
No, because this was prior to 79.
I'm not trying to argue with you. I'm just
I'm
trying
just
to
trying
make
to
sure the
explain
record is
her
clear.
statement. Prior to 79, she lived there. It was exempt when the rent control passed. This place has been exempt for 40 years.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Michael Millman has stated that he will not speak but requested 3 minutes. Would you like 3 minutes?
No, I enjoyed the law review.
As we always do.
We always do, so I'm submitting.
Okay, great. Okay, Ileana Navarro, you have 3 minutes.
Hello. So I believe the board should affirm the hearing officer's recommendation for Ms. Brown to pay the money she overcharged on my rent. The rent control is credible and has specific calculations, and Ms. Brown's calculations are incorrect and shouldn't be granted. She received letters from rent control advising her of the overcharge, but yet continued to collect the overcharge amount knowingly. And that's all.
Thank you. We have no further comments on this item, and I do not see any commissioners in the queue. Did you, Commissioner Foster? I mean, I guess I think it's pretty clear to me what, based off my comments, that I disagree with the legal interpretation that Mr. Perry has put forward. I also think that this is these are some convenient arguments given that Ms. Brown, the record reflects that Ms. Brown knew there was a disparity between the MAR calculated by the board and the MAR calculated and charged by Ms. Navarro beginning in 2015, as exhibited by the 3 different attempts to register Ms. Navarro's tenancy on different occasions here at different rents. So that and the totality of the circumstances and the facts and record lead me to be prepared to make a motion. Does anyone else have any further comments? Mr. Duran, Commissioner Duran.
Thank you. In reviewing the report, it does seem clear to me, based on the actions from Commissioner Brown, that there was knowledge, at least at the point of February 19th, 2016, and despite that knowledge, the communications that had been made to the board back and forth made clear what the law was, and it was clear. I feel like this is kind of an easy decision in that sense, because the overcharge happened despite that, and despite actually the board's hearing that we had to clarify the language on the MAR back then. Makes it clear to me that there was an overcharge in this case. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Commissioner Duran. Did someone want to make a motion here, or should I do that? Okay. Did you want to say something? Okay, I move to grant the hearing officer's findings of fact and conclusions of law, and affirm their decision. Do I have a second?
Second.
Great. Can we get a roll call vote?
Yep. Commissioner Phyllis? Yes. Commissioner Duran?
Yes.
Commissioner Foster?
Yes.
Commissioner Salton? Yes. And Commissioner Trosas?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thanks. All right, moving on to our administrative item 12A, whether to recommend that City Council amend the municipal code to permit a tenant to challenge administrative citations. Can we hear a staff report?
The board initiated this item in response to a tenant's claim that she was evicted for a zoning code violation that, in her view, never existed. The city's code compliance division determined that a trellis that the tenant had erected on her balcony violated the city's zoning law. After more than a year of dispute with the landlord about whether her trellis really was illegal, the landlord evicted the tenant for refusing to remove it. The eviction was successful because the trial court agreed with the landlord and with the city that the trellis was illegal. The tenant complained to one or more board members that she never had the opportunity to challenge the underlying assertion that the trellis was illegal. The board initiated this item to explore whether there is some recommendation that it could make to the city council to ensure that future tenants are not evicted for allegedly illegal conditions without the tenants first having had a forum in which to challenge the claim of illegality. When I wrote the staff report for this item, I had understood that the tenant was never afforded an opportunity to challenge the city's assertion that her trellis violated the zoning ordinance. As the written staff report makes clear, I suggested that the board might consider recommending that the city council amend the municipal code so that future tenants in the same position would be afforded such an opportunity. I have since learned that the tenant whose situation sparked this item did in fact have multiple opportunities to challenge the city's assertion that the trellis was illegal. This is because it was not only the landlord who was cited for maintaining the trellis, but also the tenant herself, and she was issued more than one citation. Because she had been issued citations, she had a statutory right to an administrative hearing to challenge each of the citations' validity. She chose not to avail herself of that opportunity. So even the relatively straightforward recommendation that I suggested in my written staff report would not give a person in the complaining tenant's position any greater opportunity than she already had. She had the opportunity that she said that she needed, and she declined to take it. I cautioned in the written staff report that there are potential pitfalls to recommending ways to amend laws commonly affecting many people in a variety of situations in response to a perceived problem that arose only once, if ever, affecting only one person and may never occur again in the future. It is for this reason that staff is not in this item recommending that the board make any recommendation to the City Council to change local law. Rather, staff is merely recommending that should the board decide to make any recommendation to the City Council, that the recommendation be tailored as closely as possible to combat the perceived harm at which it is aimed. The perceived harm was the eviction of a tenant because her landlord was cited for an allegedly illegal condition that the tenant herself created, which the tenant does not believe to have been illegal, and which the tenant had no opportunity to challenge. Staff has no information that this situation has ever occurred, and although staff believes that it had occurred uniquely in this case, it is now clear that it did not. But if the board wished to recommend that City Council amend the municipal code so that this situation does not arise in the future, it could lawfully do so. As noted in the written staff report, the board could recommend that the council amend the municipal code to allow a tenant to challenge an administrative citation alleging the existence of any code violation at the tenant's unit, regardless of to whom the citation was issued. I would also note that when code compliance decides to issue a citation, they endeavor to issue that citation to the person who they believe is responsible for the violation. So if they believe that the tenant is the responsible party, they will cite that person. They often sometimes will also cite the landlord, or if they don't believe or know that the tenant is the responsible party, only the landlord. In weighing whether to recommend that the City Council make such an amendment to the municipal code, staff recommends that the board give due weight to the caution that every new law or change to existing law carries with it the danger of unintended consequences. It is always worth weighing whether the risk of those consequences is outweighed by or outweighs the need to solve a problem that rarely occurs, may not yet have occurred, and may never occurred. But that is ultimately a problem for policymakers, that is the people's elected representatives, and not staff to grapple with. Staff's role as to this issue is limited to advising the board as to what it can do, not what it should do. There had been a suggestion that the board recommend that the City Council allow tenants to apply for zoning variances as to their landlord's property to permit things affecting only the tenants as individuals. As noted in the written staff report, such a recommendation, if accepted, would not resolve the problem that the board identified in this case and could not lawfully be drafted to do so. Thank you.
Sorry, question. Tell me the specific code. I think it's in here. The specific code section at issue in the case at hand. Was it in there?
It's not in the.
You mean the section of the code for which the tenant was cited?
Yes, and what exactly does it state? Because you suggested we try to make our remedy as narrow as possible. So
No. So not the one for which she was cited. The one that sets forth the basis for who can challenge a
Exactly.
compliance violation. Right. So
yeah, what is it? What does it state? Generally speaking,
the municipal code says that whoever is cited has the right to challenge that citation.
Is that process clear, and is it made available to people when they're cited?
Yes, and it was
on the citation.
Yes, and it was that, and that happened in this case.
Okay. Okay. No further questions. We do have some comments on 12. Oh, do you want to say something first? Is she left? Yeah, sure. Why not? Yeah, it's her. Yeah, go ahead.
So because,
I mean, it's her item. Yeah, we can allow her to do that. Go ahead.
So, because I originated this item, I was requesting the opportunity to speak regarding the issue of whether it would be helpful to so regarding the issue of whether the code adequately provides opportunities for tenants to cure citations that can serve as the underlying basis for an unlawful detainer action. We spoke about this before, and I believe the specific code compliance violation provides that the property owner is cited. Do you have the language? Because it's not in the staff report, and I want to be very precise here.
The citations are issued to the quote-unquote responsible person, responsible party. In this case, code compliance determined that it was the tenant who was the responsible party and cited the tenant.
Okay.
They also cited the owner, but they cited the tenant too.
Okay, because here's the problem, and here's why I don't think that our regulation currently goes far enough. Whose regulation? The ordinance that currently provides for code compliance violations. If code compliance determines that there is a violation and they do not cite the tenant, they cite the landlord, that deprives the tenant as the responsible party, the party who's not issued in the tenant, any opportunity to challenge the citation. Now here, I'm not sure, because I don't know the specifics of this action, I'm not sure whether it was the citation to the landlord that served as the basis for the unlawful detainer, or whether it was the citation to the tenant, or whether it was both. But if it was the landlord's citation that served as the basis for the unlawful detainer action, and the tenant is deprived of any opportunity to challenge that citation because they are not the responsible party on the basis of the citation, I have an issue with that, which is why I think the original discussion that we had is still applicable here. Now, I disagree with the characterization of how I requested the opportunity for tenants to have a variance. I'm not requesting for anything inherent in being a tenant to provide the basis, the substantive basis for a variance. I do think that as a holder of a possessory interest in land, that tenants should be entitled to apply for a variance in the same manner in which a property owner in fee simple, or however they hold it, applies for a variance. I'm not saying that substantively they should be entitled to it because they're a tenant. I'm not saying substantively there's anything unique to the tenant that affords them the opportunity. I'm just saying a possessory interest should permit someone to be eligible, to have standing, to seek a variance if all other issues are met. Here, I recognize that the variance issue is kind of a moot point because really this is about a code compliance citation. So I want to take the code compliance citation first and say that I do think it's necessary that we make these recommendations. And I want to make the point that I think it's necessary to make that recommendation because even if it's only one tenant loses their home because of a regulation that doesn't afford them the opportunity to challenge a citation that serves as the basis of an unlawful detainer action. That's too many for me. And I don't think I don't think we have enough information to say that this has only happened one time. So I don't find that really compelling as a basis for justifying it. And I do want to make a point on the record, and I want to be very, very clear, that I do not think the interpretation of the zoning code and the prohibition on trellis was correctly or accurately applied in this circumstance. I think that they got the law wrong, and I think that it was a mistake of law, and I leave that to the courts to make that determination. That's not before us on the board tonight, but I do think that there were fundamental misunderstandings in the case that precipitated this action. So I just want to make it very, very clear.
Yeah, and I just also have to kind of second, well, I just want to respond to that because if you look at the staff report on page 2, and again, I don't know with specificity what actually occurred, but it's very clear that the landlord is the one that got cited for the zoning violation. It was the landlord's responsibility to take down the trellis, and because the tenant did not want to take down the trellis, the landlord then had grounds to serve a 3-day notice to perform or quit. And that is extremely concerning for me here. If someone can show me something differently, that'd be interesting. But given our own staff report, I don't think there's enough due process for the tenant in this situation.
I'm sorry to interrupt. As I mentioned in the oral presentation, that was inaccurate. I later learned that the tenant was also cited. So the tenant had 3 opportunities to request a hearing to challenge the validity of the citation.
But was the was the 3-day notice based on the landlord's ability to require the tenant to take down the trellis?
It wasn't based on this. The UD wasn't based on the citation. It was based on the condition, and the court determined that it was an illegal condition, and on that basis, awarded a judgment for possession to the landlord.
I feel uncomfortable about the entire situation, and I also think that well, anyways, we're not in discussion. So Elaine Golden-Giller, you have 3 minutes.
What happens when a Santa Monica tenant takes the law into her own hands? Rent Board member Nicole Phillis wants the city to change the law and say no harm, no foul. Here's what this item is really all about. The tenant's landlord was given a citation by the city's code compliance division about a trellis on the patio of the tenant's unit in violation of the city's zoning ordinance. After receiving the citation, the landlord ordered the tenant to cure the violation by removing the long-standing trellis from her patio. The tenant did not agree that the trellis violated any law, and she refused to remove it. So the landlord took the trellis down to avoid continued citations for the violation. After the landlord took down the trellis, the tenant put it back up. The landlord again got cited for the zoning violation, and after receiving the citation, another citation actually, the landlord gave the tenant a 3-day notice to remove the tenant trellis or be evicted, during which period the tenant continued to maintain the trellis on her patio. The tenant ended up being forced out of her unit when the Superior Court ruled against her argument. If this passes, get your employment application ready for a job at Planning and Zoning, because they will be needing many more workers. The results of Nicole's proposed ordinance could create 27,000 different zoning codes, one for each unit depending on the whims of each tenant. In summary, rather than having tenants obey the law, attorney and rent board member Nicole Phillis prefers to ask the city to change the law. Keep watching this rent board meeting to find out if the other commissioners will give common sense a chance. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Moving on, we have Matthew Millen. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Matthew Millen. I live in Santa Monica. So I own a building in which I live, and I use the standard Agla Apartment Association lease, which provides the renter shall not alter the premises without the written consent of the owner, and except through licensed insured professionals approved in advance by the owner in writing. So if a tenant creates a dangerous position, a dangerous condition, and I'm cited to remove that condition, and the tenant isn't cited. If the tenant's cited, then they can follow through with their own appeal. But if the owner is cited for the condition and not the tenant, and the tenant is allowed to file an appeal, even though the owner wants to remove the dangerous condition, who's liable for the damages to the injured party if someone's injured by the dangerous condition? So let's assume the trellis falls off the patio and injures a child on the ground. My insurance company isn't going to pay damages to the injured person because the city prevented me from removing the dangerous condition. It's not my fault that the child is injured. I try to take the trellis down, but the tenant, we'll assume the tenant isn't cited. If they are cited, then it's a different issue. The tenant isn't cited, but they're given the right to file an appeal even if they're not cited. Who's going to pay for those damages? I'm not paying. The city's going to be liable, and the tenant's going to be liable. So if you're going to approve something like this, you should have a requirement that the tenant have $1 million liability policy. I rent my office space. I have to have a liability policy, and I have to include the landlord as co-insured on my liability policy. So if a tenant wants to appeal a dangerous condition, and the landlord wants to eliminate that dangerous condition, as a prerequisite for filing the appeal, the tenant should have to have at least $1 million liability policy, so if someone's injured during the appeal time, the injured person will be able to seek damages. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Millen, for your points. We have Eileen Carey. You have 2 minutes. Well, you wrote 2. You can have 3 if you want. Oh, that's right. Thank you for the reminder. 2 minutes.
Good evening, everyone. I am very familiar and intimately familiar with this subject this evening, and I'd like to say that the staff report is filled with many factual errors, and it misstates the facts and it misstates the finding of the court. So I don't think that Mr. Lewis was properly informed. Having said that, I have read your staff recommendation, and I say yes. I say yes that City Council should change the municipal code because it is discriminatory. Presently, it denies constitutional due process rights to one class of citizen, people who rent, and it guarantees due process rights to another class of citizen, people who own. The second analysis makes the point clear, the second analysis in the report. Presently, the process, a notice of violation gets issued first, and then later a citation. In the case you're referencing, that did not happen. A citation was issued first in the morning, and then approximately 10 hours later in the evening, a notice of violation was issued. This is in the record of the City Code Enforcement Division. Anyway, having said that, so with that in mind, a person can challenge a traffic ticket, which is a citation. So too, a person should be able to challenge the validity and veracity of a notice of violation and subsequent citation, regardless if they are a renter or a property owner. Additionally, code compliance is a law enforcement division, and they must be held accountable. They should be able to prove their allegations of violations to both tenants and owners equally. In this case, where Mr. Lewis misstated the facts, I am informed and believe very clearly that, and I've seen documented evidence, that the tenants in this case did indeed contact code compliance, and code compliance was non-responsive.
Thank you, Ms.
Do it.
Carey. Yep.
Yes.
Ms. Carey, just for the record.
Yes.
In your case, was the zoning citation that was at issue the 42-inch prohibition on hedges, fences, and walls?
The zoning prohibition, yes, Ms. Phyllis, it was 9.21.050, the hedge height law.
Yep.
And I would like to make something very clear, if I may take a moment.
I just want to make sure.
Okay.
Did they find that the hedges, fences, and walls 42-inch limit applied to your unit?
Did who?
Did the court?
No.
Okay. Is it your position that you should have been subject to the 8-foot limitation?
Yes.
Okay. That's all I want to know. That's all. That's all I want to know, because that's really not before us, but I just want to be able to use the example to make a point. So that was my only question.
Okay.
And I really want to keep our record clean.
Yes. Understood.
Okay, great. Commissioner Foster has a question.
I have a question.
Yes.
So this is a clarifying question for me, because staff has presented us with new evidence that they are using as part of their staff report tonight that's not in the published staff report. So I just want to, because that was a surprise to me.
Yes.
So I just want to ask, is it true that you had 3 separate opportunities to present a case about 42 versus 8 feet?
No.
In response to the citations?
No, it is not accurate. No.
Is there a notice on the bottom of the citation saying that you have an opportunity to contest?
We do not, let's strike that. We did not receive any citation. We received
Notice of violation.
a notice of violation, which is a warning letter, that said, that didn't have the papers attached to it, but when I requested the additional paper, it said, if you are not the responsible person or there is a violation, contact code compliance. I sent an email to code compliance. I made an outline. They responded with the definition of offense. Code compliance was subsequently contacted in April of 2018. Their record showed complied. We never heard from them again.
And I just want to be super clear. that's not what's before us right
That's
now.
correct.
And I really want to focus on this regulation,
Yes.
but I very much appreciate your time
Yeah.
in being here tonight. And
I am,
bringing this to our
well,
attention.
thank you. I am considering that as being part of
Yeah.
what's before us.
Yeah,
So
okay.
thank you.
May I, regarding due process, this is what this is about. You're asking the city council whether the rent control board should make a recommendation. And when we have a constitutional right to due process, it should not be denied to any citizen, whether they are a property owner or whether they support property owners through the payment of their rent. If you are in the courthouse, you see traffic court. When you get a citation, you get to go to court and challenge the validity of that. You get to see the evidence. Code compliance does not have any answerability to anyone. And as a citizen, I feel that my rights are being summarily denied because I rent instead of own.
Yep. Thank you, Ms. Carey.
Thank you, Ms. Carey.
Commissioner Phillips, do you have a question?
No, I just want to.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Jay Johnson, you have 2 minutes. Is Jay Johnson here?
Thank you.
Jay Johnson left and leaving with him his comment. Okay. Moving on, Commissioner Phillips.
So, a couple points. One, on the issue of the citation. Given the lack of clarity around this issue, including the fact that there was a lack of clarity even among staff as to whether it was the citation to the tenant or the citation to the landlord that served as the basis for the unlawful detainer, or that it was, or that the tenant had the opportunity to cure the citation, I think that further supports recommending a very simple, very narrow, very closely tailored amendment to the city's ordinance that would permit a tenant to attempt to cure or challenge a code compliance violation based on any arguments available to them. Now, in this case, I think that there are completely valid arguments, and I want to be very specific on the record here as to why hedges, fences, and walls and the 42-inch height limitation should not have applied to a trellis on a ground floor patio. I want to be very clear that my understanding is, if it applies at all, that the 8-foot limitation that applies to a pergola would make much more sense here. Now, that's not before the board. What's before the board is the fact that tenants do not currently have the right to cure a citation that is issued to a landlord that a landlord may in turn use to turn around and evict a tenant. We know of at least one circumstance in which that happened, and I think that's too much. If we want to give tenants the right to fight a landlord's battles, to fix a code compliance violation on an issue that pertains to their units, I say, what's the harm? The only potential harm is if we don't change it and tenants continue to be evicted in the same manner in which we saw happen. So I strongly ask for my fellow commissioner support to make a recommendation to City Council that we amend our ordinance to simply afford tenants the right to cure or challenge or appeal code compliance citations issued to a landlord pertaining to their unit. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Phillips. Commissioner Foster.
Thank you, Chair. Staff, can I ask another question? Would Measure R have applied in this situation, and did it apply in this situation, the ability to have a curative period when a landlord feels that there is something wrong or a lease violation or something that's creating a hazard or an insurance problem, et cetera, et cetera? And do you know if that remedy was applied in this case?
Yes, it would apply. I don't know whether whether the landlord in this case identified a notice as a Measure RR notice, but there were discussions about but there were discussions about this for over a year before the UD was filed. So there were.
Well, I think there were multiple UDs filed on the record.
Right, but before the first one was filed.
Yeah. I am incredibly sympathetic to what this tenant went through. I highly think it was probably unfair probably even unjust, but and there's no question that I feel that way. But I wish it mattered what I, as a rent control board commissioner, thought about 42 inches versus 8 feet. That's not my purview or my decision. And I just am a little worried. You know, I actually, Mr. Millen's comments had an impact on me about insurance and liability. I am concerned about utilizing our power and our board's good name to make frequent and often recommendations to another elected body about what they should be doing. I have availed myself already of these some of these remedies in my capacity as an individual citizen and an individual commissioner to council already. I'm happy to speak at council meetings to anything I think is a great idea for tenants. I am just concerned about, I hate to use such rudimentary terms as a can of worms, but potential, just like it said, unintended consequences, because this is, I think, more complex than I initially thought it might be. And I just think we should exercise caution when utilizing the power of this board to advise another body over which we have no jurisdiction. And I'm just cautious on that basis alone.
Commissioner Duran.
I'm curious as to, and I don't know if this would apply to council or to Commissioner Phyllis, the difference in what's the difference between what was recommended by staff and what you suggested a moment ago, just so that I'm clear on the differences, if there are any.
Sure. So my recommendation is different than the oral recommendation of staff, which is agnostic, not to change anything, and consistent with the recommendation in the staff report
As written,
which is unbelievably narrow. And I just want to make the point that it is not unprecedented by any stretch of the imagination for this body to make recommendations to City Council. We've done it with the tenant harassment ordinance. We did it with code compliance and means and method plans. We did it with seismic retrofitting, all within our purview. So I think, City Council knows this is coming. It's not unprecedented. I appreciate my fellow commissioners' consideration.
May I respond
briefly?
briefly?
I still have the floor.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay.
Commissioner Duran, continue.
Thank you. So, you made me lose it.
I'm sorry.
Okay, so I'm going to stall until it comes back.
That's okay. Take all the time you need.
Do you remember Mr. what was it? Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. He started reading a book. Was it Huck Finn? I wish I had that now, so until I could remember what it. This is not a filibuster. Okay, so.
You sure about that?
Well, you were asking about the difference.
Sounds like a
between
filibuster.
staff and what-
Yeah. Oh, yes.
You're
Okay.
welcome.
So thank you. So the point is that if the recommendation as written goes through, there's still a lot of steps before any real changes happen. For example, a tenant can go and their challenge can be denied, and it goes away. The recommendation can go to the city council, and they can choose not to take our recommendation. So I still think there's a lot of protections in place to safeguard issues that were discussed. I will say, for the one landlord who spoke earlier, he did raise a point that I had not considered, and it's a very good point, is the insurance issue, right? If you're going to take it to the level that he had suggested, it is a concern then to preclude his opportunity to be able to, defend any kind of accident that would happen, and at the expense of having the tenant just go ahead and just require a variance or whatever challenge they wanted to bring forth. That is an issue of concern, because that kind of just doesn't seem fair, where there's no skin in the game, so to speak, for the tenant in regards to the consequences of the variance, or while the appeal is going on. That is something that should be looked at more closely. But anyway, in summary, I'm kind of inclined with letting the recommendation as written go forward, because I feel, as I stated, that there are several steps before any drastic or real consequences could happen as checks and balances. Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner Drawn. So I think that I'm familiar with the administrative citation process, with respect to wage enforcement. I'm not as familiar with this administrative citation process, but I do know that there's supposed to be a notice of violation and then a citation issued. And I think that it's sufficiently vague here and potentially going in other circumstances that we don't know about, such that we don't really know the administrative citation process for landlords and tenants when there's a condition on a tenant's property that the landlord is responsible for. I'd also like to add that this is not a dangerous condition issue. This is a trellis pergola issue. Of course, I very much agree with Mr. Millen's point that, and that was a great point, that we need to be judicious about opening people up to liability, and I certainly don't want to do that. But I do think that I'm very concerned about what happened here. I'm very concerned about how the law was applied. I'm fearful that it might be too late in this circumstance, but let's not let this happen again. And I would have to agree with Commissioner Phyllis that one time is one time too many. Just because this isn't in our direct jurisdiction doesn't mean that I take the approach that, I was elected, but it's not our problem, so I'm not going to do anything about it. I still think that this affects our constituents, and I'm sufficiently concerned such that I think that we should recommend something to City Council in our purview as policymakers for them to take up and make the ultimate determination on. So I would just make a quick amendment that we recommend that City Council review the administrative citation process with respect to citations that pertain to tenants and landlords, and consider whether to amend the code, and of course the pros and cons of that. So that is kind of how I'm feeling at this point. Commissioner Phyllis.
I'll be very, very brief. I think my fellow commissioners have tapped in to the core issue here, which is that as presently written, our municipal ordinance creates a legal situation in which you can have enforcement without opportunity. Enforcement to issue a citation, enforcement to have that underlying citation be used as the basis for an unlawful detainer if issued to a landlord without providing a tenant the opportunity to cure the citation. So again, I think allowing a tenant to fight a battle that benefits both the tenant and the landlord to cure a citation is an admirable, appropriate, and just goal. And I just want to make very clear on this insurance issue points, because it's something that seems to be hanging up my fellow commissioners, that if there is a citation of a code compliance violation and it goes to an appeal and ultimately it's determined no violation, doesn't apply, that can be used as a basis to demonstrate the absence of a dangerous condition, the absence of a violation of the code in a way that would hurt the public, the absence of a deviation. So I don't think that we should allow that to preclude us from making a very simple very narrow fix that basically, helps both tenants and landlords to resolve code compliance violations. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Foster.
Thank you. I'd like to respond to a couple of comments from earlier. We do send things to council when appropriate and when it's something 3 out of 5 of us feel strongly enough about to send. And that's totally in our abilities, and we've done it many times. I was simply stating that this is a very specific code category that this item seems to be concerned with, yet this recommendation would open it up to hundreds of codes, not just one about trellises and fences. And I just thought that we should be cautious when sending a recommendation up that is one very clear niche problem, but that exposes a plethora of other areas of the law. That was my response to that. I'm an elected official, but it's not that I'm not going to do anything. It's just that I'm concerned about being cautious about what our prerogative is, and all 5 of us are entitled to our opinion about what that is. I'm being cautious about the weight and brevity that this board brings to things that we send on to other bodies, and I'm just discussing caution. I'm glad the city has Measure R protections for both rent-controlled and non-rent controlled tenants. I've seen it assist in processes and slow things down in time for tenants to have a chance to respond to very difficult situations that the landlord and their attorneys may have a better handle on than an unsuspecting tenant. Only has 3 days to figure out the whole law. You know, that's very concerning. Further, just as a note, just because a notice was given erroneously, perhaps, doesn't mean that staff hasn't just told me that the city already has an avenue for the tenant to contest it. Now, I'm not saying that the notice was properly given, but staff, whom I believe wouldn't report this if it wasn't true, says that the bottom of the citation does present a tenant an opportunity to respond. So just because the notice was not given correctly doesn't mean that what we're about to recommend isn't already available. So I'm just trying to protect the veracity of the things that we put forward. If there is already something on the citation printed that, I mean, I wish we had it here, that says the tenant has standing, then we don't need to send a recommendation asking for tenants to have standing if it's already there. I'm not disagreeing that perhaps the notice was erroneously served. I'm just asking for clarification if the procedure we're about to maybe ask for isn't already there. Staff, do you have anything further to...
Stephen Lewis is in the queue.
Good.
But Commissioner Sultan wanted to say, did you want to respond to her?
Well, I just wanted to just clarify something so that everybody's talking about the same thing. What I said earlier was that a person who is cited has the opportunity to challenge the citation. If only person A is cited, person B does not have the ability to challenge it. But it is the case that to whomever the citation is issued, they have the right to challenge the citation. Code enforcement has informed us that the tenant in this case was actually cited and actually fined 3 separate times. And so their statement to us is that a citation was issued giving her the opportunity to challenge the citation. Had she not been cited, however, she would not have had that opportunity. Only the person who was cited under the current law has the right to challenge the citation.
And to clarify, the landlord was also cited.
Yes, that's true.
And the tenant would not have, for the exact same thing.
Yes.
And the tenant would not have had the opportunity under the current state of the law to challenge that
That's
citation.
correct.
Thanks.
Thank you for the clarification.
Okay, let's moving on here. Commissioner Sultan.
I just wanted to briefly say that I appreciate the concern about not making too many changes to the law, about potential unintended consequences, but I do feel like this is pretty narrowly tailored, but also pretty important that tenants have the right to attempt to cure violations on their property. And I think the concern about like, oh, there's going to be a flood of tenants showing up at code enforcement and just, we're going to have to hire all these new people. I think that's a little bit overblown. It sounds like folks are saying they haven't really seen a lot of these cases come up. This is maybe the first case in the memory of the people here. But it is, I think, as a tenant, I would definitely want that opportunity to appeal if there was something that concerned my own unit. I do have a property interest in that unit, a possessory interest. And so I do support suggesting this amendment of the code to City Council.
Great. So with that being said, and no further comments in the queue, I would move, or Commissioner Phillips, do you want to move? Go ahead. I just had that one amendment to the second recommendation on our staff report. I mean, we can recite the problem that we think we've identified, or we can not. We can, I mean, yeah, go ahead.
Two things. One, just to clarify, also something that was suggested before. The oral presentation and the staff report are not making two different recommendations. In both cases, I'm saying that if the board wants to do something, both cases, I'm saying if the board wants to do something, this is what it could lawfully do. This is what it could recommend that the City Council do, and the City Council could lawfully do that. In both cases, I'm not saying whether the board should do it or shouldn't do it. The staff is not opining about whether the board should or shouldn't. Staff is simply saying that it's wise to consider whether there are unintended consequences, and the board has considered that.
Right.
So the only difference between the two reports, the written one and the oral one, is the addition of the facts provided to us by code compliance.
Alleged facts provided by code compliance.
Well, yes, the statement to us that 3 citations were issued.
Sure.
That's the only difference. There's no difference in the recommendation. Second, given what the recommendation was, which was to what I understand the board is talking about is recommending that the City Council make whatever amendments to the municipal code are necessary to ensure that if anyone is cited for a violation occurring at the landlord, at a tenant occupied unit, that the tenant has the opportunity to challenge the validity of the citation. And I fully understand what that means and can draft a letter that makes that recommendation. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually, well, again, this is Commissioner Phyllis's item, but I would also like more information, and maybe you can just give it to us offline for my own personal edification as to what the process is for both landlords and tenants, because it seems, just again, in full disclosure, we've been contacted about this situation for months now. And in my own research about what's been happening, and then there seems to be a lot of ambiguity about what this process is. And I do know that the notice of violation and then citation process is confusing. So, I mean, maybe you could just,
I can give you that information.
Provide information, and then I can decide like how much I really want to pursue this from like an advocacy standpoint to City Council.
Yes, I'd be happy to do that.
Right. But I think
Are you suggesting tabling until next
meeting?
No.
I don't think there's any harm in us recommending that City Council consider, and they can either consider it and do something or not do anything or just get the letter that potentially there's an issue here. And we would like to be able to ensure that this doesn't happen to anyone else. Yeah, so I think Stephen's correct, and I don't know that we need to make a motion.
Yeah, I just want to be very clear. I want to recommend to City Council that they change the municipal code to allow tenants the opportunity to cure citations for code compliance violations issued to landlords that pertain to their possessory interests on the unit. Cure and challenge. Whatever the appeal is,
yeah,
the
they
appeal
have the
process.
right to cure at any time. I mean, there's
right.
Yeah,
Right.
there's nothing in the code about
Right.
curing.
They can abate it. I understand.
Yeah. So, and my understanding is that of what the board is talking about substantively is that the recommendation would not be just if a citation is issued to the landlord, but if the citation is issued to anyone about a code violation affecting the tenant's unit, because it may be the owner, it may be the property manager.
People have like jurisdiction over that. I mean, it's not some random person that can come and challenge it. It would have to be someone with standards.
No, he's talking about if the citation's issued to like a property owner versus the management company.
Or a homeowners association or whomever. Because the harm that the board has identified is a tenancy being at risk by virtue of a claim that a condition violates the law
Yeah.
and not having the opportunity to challenge that underlying claim.
Yes.
And so the recommendation, based upon my understanding of what the board has discussed tonight, would be that the city council consider making whatever amendments to the municipal code are necessary to afford tenants that opportunity, regardless of to whom the citation is issued.
Yeah, and I think there is goodwill among the board that it's not just that they consider it, but that that there is a recommendation that tenants be able to have that opportunity. If a citation is issued to a property owner for some sort of violation because of the tenant, right? Issued to person A, but affects person B should have the opportunity to appeal or challenge that violation. That's all I'm recommending.
Yes, that's my understanding of what I said.
Okay, great. Thanks. Do we need to take
Commissioner
official action?
Commissioner Foster wants to say something.
Yeah, I've got another comment.
Okay.
I appreciate staff's clarification on that last point. That is something that I am comfortable with as a matter of, I definitely think that someone with a possessory interest has a right to at least know about things that are potentially affecting their tenancy. So that part of it I'm comfortable with. It was the language more broadly saying that any tenant can apply for any variance for anything seemed too broad. Well, that's what was in the initial proposal.
Well, it doesn't matter. We've come to the realization that this is what we want.
Okay, well, I was asking earlier, is this two parts or is this one part? I'm in favor of this part.
Yeah, I think.
Is there anything more broad than what we've just arrived at still on the table?
No, I'm comfortable with that, with what
Okay.
Mr. Lewis put forward.
Okay,
Okay, so
great.
are we clarified? Okay, great.
Can we take an official?
Let's-
I would request that we take an official action on it.
Yes,
Mr. Gwynn,
the board should.
can you? We've moved.
I move to recommend, here we go. I move to recommend to City Council to amend the municipal code to afford tenants the right to cure, challenge, or appeal code compliance violations issued to a responsible party that pertains to a possessory interest in the tenant's unit.
That's different.
And just to clarify, that what the board is really voting on is to direct the administrator to send the letter with that recommendation to
Yes.
the board.
Yes.
I mean, to the council.
Second.
Commissioner Foster.
Yes.
Commissioner Duran.
Yes.
Commissioner Phyllis.
Yes.
Commissioner Sultan.
Yes.
And Commissioner Trosis.
Yes.
Motion carried.
Thank you. I now request that we move to adjourn. Does anyone want to?
Second.
Okay, I move
Oh.
to adjourn. Commissioner Duran wants to leave. He seconded. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Great. We are now adjourned. Thanks so much.